Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was walking home late one night through the cornfields near my house in central Iowa. It was around 11 p.m., maybe a little later. I usually don't take that route after dark, but that night I missed the bus and figured I could cut through the fields to save some time. The air was still and humid, the kind you get in late summer just before a storm rolls in, though no rain was coming yet. The moon was mostly hidden by clouds, so the field was darker than usual. The corn was tall, maybe 8 feet or more, and it rustled softly in the breeze. I could hear crickets and the occasional frog croak, but mostly just the quiet shuffle of my footsteps through the dirt path I knew ran between the rows. I wasn't worried. I'd been out there plenty of times before, usually in the daytime, but sometimes in the evening with friends. Never by myself this late, though. As I was walking, I caught a faint red glow ahead, just between the stalks. At first, I thought it was some farm equipment left running, or maybe one of those small blinking marker lights they sometimes put on irrigation systems. The lights were small and blinked slowly, red and soft, like the tail lights on a tractor. It was about 20 feet ahead, not too far. Curious, I headed toward it. As I got closer, the lights seemed to lower from where I thought they were. I looked more carefully and realized they weren't on any machines or poles. Instead, the red lights hovered just above the ground, flickering gently like little fireflies, but in a very steady pattern. They didn't flash wildly or move around erratically, just a slow, rhythmic blink. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. The corn around the lights didn't move, except when I brushed against it. The lights then slowly began to rise. Not fast, more like a smooth, careful float. They lifted from just above the dirt up to about eye level with me, maybe 4 or 5 feet off the ground. I swear they didn't drift away or scatter like bugs might, just moved straight up, one after the other, as if someone was raising them by hand. I was getting a little uneasy now, but I wasn't sure what I was even seeing. I called out softly, "Hello?" But there was no answer. The lights blinked in the same slow pattern. Nothing changed except they were all at roughly the same height now, facing me from the rows on either side. My heart was starting to beat faster, and I pulled out my phone, flipping on the flashlight to get a better look. The moment the light came on, the red lights vanished. Just gone, like they were never there. The cornfield was pitch dark again, except for my phone's beam cutting through the stalks. I stayed still for a moment, scanning with the flashlight. Nothing. No sounds except my breathing and the usual bugs. I turned the light off and took a step forward, then another. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, like the air was holding its breath. I was about halfway through the path when I heard a soft tapping behind me. Not loud, more like a faint knocking sound on the stalks, rhythmic, almost like a code but slower. I spun around, shining the flashlight back, but nothing was there. No movement, no shadow, just empty corn swaying lightly. I tried to convince myself it was a branch, or maybe an animal, a raccoon or a bird maybe. But the tapping stopped as suddenly as it started, and I didn't hear anything else. I didn't want to stick around, so I quickened my pace, walking faster through the field. The path wasn't straight. It twisted a little with the way the crops were planted, so I had to be careful not to trip. The night felt colder now, even though the air hadn't changed much. Then I noticed something else. The flashlight on my phone started flickering, just for a second, then back on. I tapped the screen, tried to reset it, but it was glitchy, dimming and brightening like it was struggling to stay on. I stopped again, looked around. That's when I heard it, a low humming noise. Not loud, maybe just a few feet away, but definitely there. It wasn't mechanical like a tractor or electric like a power line, more like a deep, constant vibration that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I pointed my phone toward the sound, but the beam was too weak now to see anything. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was probably some animal or wind through the stalks, but I was wrong. Suddenly, the humming stopped, and the air grew dead quiet again, like someone had flipped a switch. I felt my skin prickling, like I just walked through something cold and invisible. I didn't like it. I didn't want to be there. I started moving again, faster now, the corn rustling loudly as I pushed through. My phone finally died completely, leaving me with only the moonlight, which was still faint and filtered through thick clouds. Then, out of the dark, I saw something else. A pair of red lights blinking slowly, low to the ground again, just like before. They were exactly where I'd seen the first set when I started. I froze. The lights didn't move or respond. They just blinked, steady and calm, as if waiting for me. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my eyes on them, but not wanting to get too close. My throat felt dry. I didn't want to look away, but I also didn't want to stare. After a few seconds, I turned and ran out of the field, back toward the main road and the streetlights near my house. When I got home, everything was normal. My phone wouldn't turn on until I plugged it in, and even then, it acted sluggish. My skin felt like it had been sunburned, tight and warm, but I hadn't been outside in the sun that day. I told my parents I got lost in the dark and just got scared. They didn't ask many questions. It's been weeks since that night, but sometimes when I'm outside alone at dusk or in the dark, I think about those lights. I wonder if I should have tried to follow them, or if I was lucky to get away at all. I don't really know what they were, or if anyone else saw them. I don't walk through the cornfields at night anymore. I was wandering through the weekend flea market just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. One of those gray late November days where the sky was low and the air had that damp chill that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. It wasn't raining, but everything felt like it might start at any moment, so the crowd was thinner than usual, mostly locals, a few tourists like me looking for something interesting or cheap. I was there mostly to kill time. I don't usually dig through flea markets, but I figured why not? There's something about old things that catches my attention. Stuff that's been around longer than me, held by people I'll never know. I kept weaving between stalls, the smell of fried dough and coffee in the air, when I noticed this small booth tucked away near the back. It was kind of out of place, more organized and neat compared to the usual cluttered tables piled with rusty tools, faded postcards, and broken trinkets. Behind the table sat an old man. He looked like he could have been born around the same time as the pocket watches he was selling. Thin white hair combed straight back, pale skin with age spots and deep-set eyes that caught the light but didn't reflect much else. He wore a simple brown cardigan, buttoned all the way up, even though it wasn't cold enough for that, not quite yet. On the table in front of him were about a dozen pocket watches, all laid out on a velvet cloth. The watches were all different shapes and sizes, some brass, some silver, some gold-toned, some plain. But what really caught my eye was how all of them were ticking in perfect sync. The same rhythm, not just close, but exactly the same beat. Tick, 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 in unison. I reached out to tap one lightly, and the rest seemed to respond, like they were connected somehow. I'm not much of a watch guy. I've never cared about collecting or fixing them, but this was strange enough to pull me in. I looked up at the man, and he smiled gently with a kind of tired patience. "They all tick the same," I said, holding up one watch. "How does that work? They're all different brands." He nodded slowly. "Yes, different times, different makers, but they're all set to the same place." His voice was calm, steady, with no hint of a joke. "Same place." I blinked, not sure what he meant. "What place?" He shrugged a little and smiled that same soft smile, but he didn't explain. I looked back down at the watches. The second hand on every one was frozen at the exact same spot. The minute and hour hands all pointed to 3:16. The ticking I'd been hearing wasn't a normal tick of a watch. It was almost like a heartbeat, steady and deep. I asked him where he got them. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached under the table and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It was black and white, grainy, showing a group of men standing in front of what looked like an old factory or warehouse. One man stood a little apart from the others, holding a pocket watch up to the camera. The photo was worn, edges frayed, but the man's face was clear. He looked a lot like the vendor himself. "They're all set to the same place," he repeated, almost to himself. "Time, it's funny, isn't it? Sometimes it stops, sometimes it moves, but it's all still the same place, no matter how it looks. I didn't know how to respond, so I asked if he could fix watches. He said he could, but he preferred to sell them. Fixing time is a bit more complicated, he added with a wink. That felt like a joke, but it didn't land quite right. Something about the way he said it was off. The way he held his hands as he spoke, they looked human enough, but moved with a kind of stiffness, like he was used to acting natural, but never quite pulled it off. I glanced around the booth, suddenly aware of how quiet it was back there. No other vendors near us. The rain had started, just a light sprinkle, but the sky was growing darker by the minute. "Do you ever get strange customers?" I asked, partly to fill the silence. He looked up and met my eyes, those pale, almost too clear eyes. "Strange is relative. I've seen many things, and not all of them make sense." He paused, then tapped one of the watches. "They're all keeping time together. That's what matters." I nodded slowly, feeling a little unnerved, but not quite ready to leave. I asked if the watches ever stopped. "Sometimes they do," he said, "but they always start again." I was about to ask more when a sharp chill ran down my neck. I glanced around and noticed that, while the rain was still gentle outside, the air in that booth felt suddenly colder. The vendor didn't seem to notice. I asked what time it was. He glanced up at a cracked wall clock behind him, then said, 3:16. I thought I heard a faint echo in his voice, like he was reading from memory. Then I realized the watches on the table were still all pointing exactly to 3:16. That's when the uneasiness really started creeping in. I started to ask if he ever felt out of place, but he interrupted me. Sometimes I wonder where time really goes when it leaves us, but that's a question for another day. I smiled weakly and said I should get going. The rain was picking up, and I wanted to beat the storm. He nodded and wrapped one of the watches carefully in a small velvet pouch, saying it was a gift. I hesitated, but took it anyway. Outside, the air was heavy with damp earth and rain. The market had started closing down. I slipped the watch into my pocket and started walking back toward my car, glancing back once at the booth. The old man was gone. The spot where he'd been sitting was empty, the velvet cloth folded neatly on the table, but no sign he'd ever been there. That was weeks ago. The watch still ticks, always in rhythm, always on 3:16. Sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can hear other watches ticking, just faint enough to hear if I listen hard. But no matter what, they never change time. It was early October, about a week after the summer crowds had died down. I was on night shift at Clear Falls State Park, which mostly meant checking that the gates were locked, patrolling the campground once or twice, and sitting in the truck with the radio on low. Nights were quiet that time of year, too quiet sometimes. Around 9:40 p.m., the ranger station phone rang. It was a guy named Darren who ran the bait shop in town. He said he'd just had two different fishermen come in, both rattled, both saying they'd seen strange lights over the lake about half an hour earlier. One claimed it looked like a lantern drifting under the water but moving too fast, and the other said it was more like a spotlight shining straight up from below. Darren figured it might be poachers or somebody messing around, so he thought I should know. I signed out the keys for the truck, grabbed a flashlight, and headed out. The lake was about a 10-minute drive from the station. It was a calm night, just a slight breeze, and the moon was barely a sliver. The air smelled like wet leaves. When I got near the turnoff to the North Shore lot, I noticed a car parked just inside the access road. Black sedan, no plates that I could see. It was angled so the headlights pointed toward the trees, not the road. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was a visitor who got lost. Then I saw two men standing on the path that led down to the water. They were facing the lake, still as fence posts. Both wore dark suits, not jackets you'd wear hiking, but pressed, tailored suits, and wide-brimmed hats that made it hard to see their faces. They weren't holding fishing rods, cameras, nothing. Just standing there. I pulled up and got out, figuring I'd walk down and see what was going on. My boots crunched on the gravel, and they both turned to look at me at the exact same time. Their movements were in sync, like they'd rehearsed it. One of them stepped forward and said, "You'll need to return to the station." His voice was deep but completely flat. There was no inflection at all. I told him I was the on-duty ranger and that I was responding to reports of lights on the lake. "This location is under federal jurisdiction tonight," he said, same tone. "You may return to the station." I asked if they could identify themselves. The second man reached into his coat and showed me something. Looked like an ID wallet, but it was so quick and angled that I couldn't read it. I caught a flash of a seal, maybe an eagle, but it was gone before I could be sure. I said, "We don't usually have federal officers here without notice," and the first man replied, "Notice has been given." I asked to who, and he just stared at me. Not angrily, not impatiently, just stared like he was waiting for me to stop talking. The silence stretched until I could hear the wind moving the branches overhead. Something about their presence felt wrong, not in a threatening way exactly, but in the way you realize you've walked into the wrong room and everyone there knows it but you. Finally, I said, "All right, I'll call this in." "You will not," the first man said immediately. Same flat voice. "Return to the station." I felt my stomach tighten. I glanced toward the water and noticed faint light rippling across the surface about 100 yards out like a reflection. But there was no source. It wasn't the moon, and it wasn't a boat. It looked like it was coming from beneath. When I looked back, both men were watching me. Not just looking, watching, like they were waiting to see what I'd do next. I don't know why, but I got the sudden urge to just leave. Not because I was scared they'd hurt me, but because I didn't want to stand there with them any longer. It felt like I wasn't supposed to see whatever was happening. I nodded, said, "All right," and walked back to the truck. I half expected them to follow, but they didn't move. When I drove out, the black sedan was still parked where I'd seen it, engine off, no lights. I went back to the station, sat at my desk, and stared at the phone for a long time. I didn't call anyone, not my supervisor, not the sheriff's office. I just sat there. Around midnight, I decided to swing back toward the lake, figuring maybe they'd be gone by then. When I got there, the sedan was gone, and the shoreline was empty. No light on the water, no footprints on the gravel. The air felt colder than it had earlier, but that could have just been the temperature drop. The next morning, I asked a couple of the other rangers if anyone had gotten word about federal officers visiting the park. Nobody had. I checked the incident logs. Nothing. Later that afternoon, I stopped by Darren's bait shop. I asked if he'd heard any more about those lights. He gave me a look like I'd said something strange and told me he didn't know what I was talking about. I reminded him about the call he made to me the night before, but he just shook his head and said, "I must have been thinking of someone else." I didn't push it. That night, when I drove past the lake on my way home, I slowed down at the North Shore turnoff. It was empty. No sedan, no figures, nothing but dark trees and the sound of crickets. But I kept driving without stopping. I met her at a party, one of those casual get-togethers that my friend Ellie throws every few months at her apartment in Seattle. It was a Saturday evening in early October, damp and cool outside, with the kind of steady drizzle that makes the city feel like it's wrapped in gray velvet. I didn't know many people there, mostly friends of friends, so I stuck close to the edges of the living room, nursing a beer and trying not to look like I was counting down the minutes. That's when I noticed her. She wasn't standing in any particular group, just by herself near the kitchen, looking around like she wasn't sure where to go next. She was maybe my age, mid-30s, with short dark hair and eyes that were too steady, like she was studying everything carefully. I don't know what made me walk over, but I did. "Hi, I'm Mark," I said, holding out my hand. She smiled, and it was a small, careful smile. "Claire," she said. We started talking, mostly about usual things, how we knew Ellie, what kind of work we did, the usual party stuff, but there was something about her voice. It was soft but clear, and it had this strange quality that I couldn't shake. It sounded exactly like someone I knew, someone I hadn't thought about in a long time. Her voice was the same as Jamie's. Jamie was my closest friend in college. We were inseparable for years, and then he died suddenly in a car accident about 6 years ago. The last few years have been hard, but I thought I had come to terms with it. Hearing that voice again was like stepping into a fog. It was familiar, but out of place. I wanted to ask if she was from somewhere else or if she just had a voice like Jamie's, but the words never came. Instead, we talked about music, movies, and the weird weather Seattle was having lately. I kept sneaking glances at her, trying to find something in her face that would explain the voice. But there was nothing, just a calm, almost blank expression that didn't quite fit with the rest of her. The party went on around us, but it felt like time slowed down whenever she spoke. I remember thinking how strange it was that Ellie hadn't introduced us yet, but the apartment was crowded, and she was busy catching up with other friends. At one point, Claire excused herself to get another drink, and I stayed by the kitchen, trying to figure out if I should say something. Before I could, Ellie came up behind me. "Oh, that's Claire. She just moved here from Portland. You two should hang out more," Ellie said, smiling like she thought this was normal. I nodded, but my mind was spinning. Portland wasn't far, but I'd never heard Jamie's voice outside of memories and old recordings. Something didn't add up. After the party, I tried to forget about it, but that voice haunted me. I kept hearing it in my head, like a recording stuck on loop. The way she said certain words, the little pauses, even the way she laughed, it was all Jamie. But Claire wasn't Jamie. Over the next few days, I looked for Claire on social media, but there was almost nothing. No posts, no photos, no mutual friends, except Ellie. When I asked Ellie about her, she said Claire was quiet, kept to herself, and didn't talk much about her past. One evening, I decided to call Ellie. I wanted to know more about Claire, to figure out if she was real or some trick my mind was playing. "Yeah, Claire's fine," Ellie said. "She's a bit weird, I guess. Keeps to herself mostly." I told her about the voice, trying to sound casual. "Oh, you mean like Jamie's? That's weird. I never thought about it before." We laughed it off, but I wasn't convinced. Then, a few nights later, I ran into Claire again at a coffee shop near my apartment. It was late, and the place was nearly empty, except for a couple of people typing away on laptops. Claire was sitting alone, sipping a black coffee and staring out the window. I hesitated but sat down across from her. We talked quietly, this time more about life and loss. Not everything, but enough to explain why her voice was so unsettling. She listened without interrupting, then said, "I know loss changes the way we hear things. Sometimes voices come back when we least expect." Her words were simple, but her eyes held something deeper, something I couldn't place. I wanted to ask more, where she was really from, why she sounded like Jamie, but something stopped me. Maybe it was respect, or maybe it was the feeling that some questions didn't have answers. On the way home that night, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her following me. But she wasn't, just the empty streets slick with rain. After that, I didn't see Claire again. I asked Ellie, who said Claire had moved out of town for a while, something about work. I kept thinking about her voice, how it was the same but not quite right, how hearing it shook something loose inside me, made me question what I thought I knew about memory and reality. It's strange how certain sounds or faces can pull you back into places you thought you'd left behind. Claire's voice was like that, a ghost I couldn't ignore even when I wanted to. I still wonder sometimes if I imagined it all, or if there's something about her that wasn't quite human. Something that looked and sounded right, but wasn't. Whatever it was, it stayed with me longer than I expected. I was assigned to the Lordsburg station out in New Mexico, which covers a stretch of the high desert west of Las Cruces. That was back in 2016. Most of our shifts were long and quiet, just miles of sand and scrub with the occasional group coming through or a busted truck we had to check out. My name's Ramon Diaz. I'd been on the job about 6 years at that point. I worked mostly nights, running surveillance from the mobile towers or monitoring the FLIR feeds back at base. Nothing fancy. A couple pan-tilt zoom cameras mounted on extendable masts, tied to thermal and IR. We'd park them on ridges and let them scan the desert in wide arcs. This happened mid-July, around 2 a.m. It was one of those nights where the heat never really dropped. High 80s even after midnight. No breeze, just the kind of dry air that sticks in your throat. I was out with my partner, Alex Trujillo. We were manning one of the forward towers up near Animas. Pretty flat land out there, broken up by low ridges and arroyos. Nothing but creosote and hard-packed sand as far as you could see. We'd set the tower up around dusk and parked the truck in a cut just below it. Most of the night was uneventful. A few jackrabbits, a small group trying to move northeast. We called it in. A team picked them up easy. After that, it went dead quiet again. Around 2:10, I was watching the IR feed while Alex was in the truck catching some rest. The camera was scanning east, low on the horizon, just tracing the slope of a shallow wash. Then it pinged something, a heat source, coming up slow out of the dark. I figured coyote at first, or maybe a mule deer, but it wasn't right. Whatever it was standing, upright, walking, and it was hot, not body temp warm, but white hot on the feed, like it had just come out of an oven. At first, it was just a shimmer in the distance, hard to make out, but as it moved closer, maybe 200 yards from the lens, the shape became clearer. 2 arms, 2 legs, head forward. Human-shaped, no question, but off. The proportions were wrong, legs too long, arms hanging low, and it didn't move like a person. No sway, no bounce, just smooth. I tried to lock the camera, but the auto track froze. Screen flickered for a second. When it came back, it was closer, way closer. It had covered 100 yards in what couldn't have been more than 2 seconds. I backed out of the zoom, thinking the system was glitching. I checked our secondary feed, the wide angle. Nothing there. The regular night vision cam wasn't picking it up, only IR. I radioed Alex to get up. I said, "You need to come look at this." He didn't answer right away, so I ran back to the truck, maybe 30 feet from the base of the tower. He was sitting up, rubbing his face. I told him something was out there, someone or something walking in fast from the south wash. He followed me to the monitor, but by the time we got back, it was gone. Just gone. We rewound the feed. There it was. The shape moving up from the edge of the frame, heat signatured, glowing like steel. Then, just before it would have come into full view of the secondary cam, it stopped. It crouched. That was the only way I can describe it. Like a squat. Then the image warped for a split second, like static. Next frame, nothing. It didn't walk away. It didn't fall. Just wasn't there. Alex thought I was screwing with him. I told him to check the system logs. They were clean. No errors, no loss of signal. We stepped outside and scanned the desert with binoculars. Nothing. Dead quiet. No wind, no bugs. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I decided to check the area where the thing appeared, maybe 300 yards from the tower. Took the truck, drove slow. We had thermal scopes, side-mounted lights. The ground was flat, hard-packed, no brush tall enough to hide behind. No footprints, not even disturbed sand. We did a full perimeter sweep, nothing turned up. We spent the rest of the shift watching that stretch, eyes glued to the screen. The IR was working fine, picked up rabbits, even a snake slithering out of a bush, but nothing even close to what we'd seen before. Next day, I pulled the recording and tagged it for review. Our supervisor Harris watched it once, then just nodded and said he'd send it up the chain. He didn't ask for details, didn't look surprised, didn't mention it again. A week later, I checked the archive. That clip was gone. Whole night's footage labeled as corrupted. Same with the backup drive. That was the last time I worked with that tower. Alex put in for a transfer 2 months later. He didn't say why, but I knew. We didn't talk about it again. Neither of us ever told anyone outside the station. But I still think about that shape, the way it moved. Like it wasn't made for our terrain, but was using it anyway, just for a little while. The knock came hard enough to make the teacup on the kitchen table jump. It was past midnight. I'd been sitting with the lamp low, listening to the wind move through the elms, thinking about hay and the tractor needing a new belt, when somebody struck the door like they wanted attention. I set the cup down, wiped my hands on my trousers, and went to the door before I'd fully told myself I was going. I opened it without turning the porch light on. The yard was a black pool, and the lane beyond the mailbox was a darker river. No shape filled the doorway. No face looked in. Only the thin kitchen light cut out onto the welcome mat and caught the wet of the gravel. I noticed the gravel then. It was not the gray you get from cold earth. It almost looked to glow, a dull kind of red at the center of the drive, spreading out over a length of a dozen paces. It didn't send heat up in the way a bonfire would, but when I put my palm over it, I felt a dry warmth, like the oven door after you've shut it. The hairs along my forearm prickled the way they do in bad weather. "Hello? Hello?" I called, though it seemed foolish to shout at nothing. The only answer was the low, steady chirp of the barn light and the far cough of the furnace in the cellar. The dog, Roscoe, didn't bark. He lay on the rug behind my feet like a sack of flour, ears down. He didn't move. I stepped out and shut the door behind me, the sound making the house feel smaller. The night smelled of iron and the cold of the fields. Up close, the gravel had that unusual baked smell, sharp, not like a car putting off heat. My boots crunched once, twice on it, and threw up a little dust that turned to steam in the lamp's light. The knock had sounded like somebody with a fist, and not a fist of any neighbor I knew. People in these parts came to a door with a shout or a step. They didn't pound and disappear. I checked the truck where I keep an old lantern and the spare gloves on the seat. The truck's engine was dark, no smoke. I took up the lantern and walked the length of the drive. There were no footprints leading away in the soft shoulder, no tire marks crawling off into the ditch. The grass at the edge of the driveway was dry, not crushed. For a farmer, the quiet is the first thing that tells you a thing's wrong. The night was too quiet. Even the frogs had stopped where they usually hissed near the pond. I thought of calling across to Harper. He sometimes kept late company in his kitchen. But the lane between our houses would have swallowed a shout. We had no telephone that reached the road. The party line in town only came when you stood in the general store. I turned instead toward the barn. If anyone had come, it was a place they'd go to, and if someone had been near the cattle, I wanted to know. The big barn doors were closed. Inside the windows, the darkness looked like oiled glass. I could see the cow lights, two dull, watchful moons through the slats. When I reached the barn, the chill there was different. It's always colder near the animals, but tonight that cold carried a kind of silence. The cows stood at their mangers the way they do when something moves near the hedgerow. Heads up, not chewing, tails still. One of them shifted her weight slowly, a deliberate move, not the restless jostle you hear when they're just impatient. I leaned my lantern over the rail to check their faces. They looked at me and then over my shoulder out into the lane, eyes reflecting the lamp. You could tell a lot from a cow's eyes, whether they were afraid, puzzled, or sleepy. These were puzzled in a way that made my mouth dry. The lane strip back to the house had that same faint, red glow. It started near the little maple and ran toward the mailbox, then melted into the road. I walked toward it and felt my boots get a little hotter with each step, a dry heat that never quite burned the leather. The metal post of the mailbox had a ring of dried dust at its base, like something had been there and then lifted away. I crouched and pressed my fingers into the dust. It left no mark. Dust that dry would crumble, but this felt compacted. The lantern made it look ordinary, but the skin along my knuckles tightened. I went out to the roadway itself and looked up. The sky was heavy. No moon I could see, only a soft cloud bank that ate light like cloth. No light moved across it. No car lights or the distant blink of a tractor. If someone had been at the door just then, they'd have had to have come from the road. There was no road steam, no engine, nothing that would explain the way the gravel had been heated. When I came back toward the house, I became aware of the kitchen clock on the mantel, the brass-faced one that keeps my mornings honest. I checked it before I went out. It had read 20 minutes past 12. Now, because this is what you do in a small life, I checked again. It read 28 minutes past 12. A full 8 minutes had passed since I put the lantern over the cows and walked the lane. I had been out not more than 3. My hands tightened around the handle until the lantern swung. I took a breath and tried to line up what my eyes had seen and what the clock said. There was a gap in the middle I could not smooth. Earlier that evening, there had been little wrong things, the sort you shrug off because you're tired. The feed boat in the barn had rattled on its chain, though I'd locked it. The radio in the parlor had given a long static that grew like a whisper and then dropped to dead silence at the end of a sentence. Roscoe had stared at the window and then gone and pressed his head to my knee and would not be shooed. I'd told myself I was making too much of nothing, but standing there with the lantern, with the warm gravel and the slow clock, the little things stacked up like stones behind my ribs. When I went back inside, I locked the door and sat the lantern on the table where the circle of its light looked like a small island in the dark. I poured another cup of tea and held it until it cooled. Roscoe settled his chin on my shoe and breathed soft. I listened for any sound from the lane. There was the faint breathing of the house, the slow click of the clock, the distant dog bark that might have been Harper's. I tried to put this in order. Someone at the door, gravel warm, missing minutes, cows still. So I walked out to the porch once more, lantern in hand, and looked down the drive. The glow had faded to a paler, almost ordinary tinge. You could stand there and tell yourself the night had done it. Sunlight from the shop must have leaked out, or the heat of the day had held. But the grass and the mailbox and the dry dust didn't match such a tidy answer. They seemed to be waiting for someone to say something sensible and give them life again. I did what a man does. I checked the locks on the barn, put the calf feed where it belongs, and kept my lantern lit on the table all night. I listened to Roscoe breathe and to the clock keep its steady business. When dawn came, the lane was not hot. The gravel was cool and gray, the dust scattered as if nothing had been pressed into it. The cows were chewing and blinking, ordinary. Later that morning, I borrowed a spade and turned over a handful of the warm area with the edge of the blade. The dirt below looked the same as the dirt beside it. No scorch, no melted stones, no trace to pin down what had happened. Harper came by with a thermos and said people had been hearing odd engines out beyond the ridge, machines with no sound he couldn't explain. He laughed at his own words, but he kept looking off toward the lane when he spoke, as if expecting to see something round and silver slip into the clouds. I kept thinking of all the little things and the way they lined up like cautions. The radio that had gone to static, Roscoe's head heavy on my knee, the clock that had gained time. I can't say what stood at the porch that night and knocked until I opened the door. I can only say what I did after. I shut the door, kept the lamp burning, made the cows sure of their mangers, and waited with the ordinary noises of the farm until morning pulled itself over the fields. There was no sign afterward that anyone had been there. The lane cooled like any other lane. The world went back to the chores. But in the small hours sometimes when wind moves just so through the elms and the lantern is a small round heart on the table, I find myself listening at the door. I saw the lights before I heard anything wrong with the night. They threaded through the furse ahead of the switchback. A neat little row of pale pinpricks, moving like somebody had strung a thin line of tiny lanterns and was shaking it gently. They didn't make any sound at all. They threaded and wheeled between trunks, dipping low under branches, then rising and weaving again, almost as if they were following the trail where a person would walk. For a second, I thought of campers with little LED markers, morons with phones lighting their way. And then I remembered I was alone on the ridge, and there was nobody on the trail that night. My headlamp was slung around my neck. I hadn't turned it on because there was a moon, big and white and full enough to throw shadows. I had my pack lighted dimly, the red LED near the zipper blinking. The air smelled like damp earth and pine pitch. My breath came out in a thin fog that stung my lungs. I stopped, just like you stop when you see deer on a road, the way your skin notices the movement before the thought does. The lights moved as if alive. They were not spaced like people, more like the pattern of attentive things. 3 in a cluster, then a single one that stalled, then 4 that spun like a thought. They had a soft warmth to them, like candlelight seen through glass, not the cold, hard white of LEDs. They didn't reflect on the wet needles or the glossy bark. Sometimes one would slip behind a trunk and come out a hair's breadth to the right as if it had gone through the trunk. I told myself not to be stupid. I told myself it was swamp gas, willow wisps, the kind of old-sounding explanation you think is ridiculous until you see it. I had been hiking with Maya and Tom earlier. They were out in front, moving faster than I was. But they had peeled off at the rocky pitch where the trail drops toward the creek. I had lagged because my knee was acting up, complaining when the slope steepened. The plan was to catch them at the switchback and maybe stop to eat. By the time I stepped out of the trees onto the little bench of trail, the lights were ahead of me, a sinuous line of tiny suns that didn't belong. I started walking. My boots barely made a sound on the packed soil. The night swallowed the click of buckles and the scratch of cloth. The lights threaded forward, and each time I thought I'd catch up, they turned and slid just out of reach, like they were curious and cautious at the same time. My heartbeat went to my throat. It's an odd sensation to feel your own blood like that, loud and private. I felt watched, but not in the way you feel when a person looks at you. This was wider, like the way a room knows you're in it. When I had maybe 50 yards to them, a breeze shifted. The pines on the left side. Somewhere below, a branch cracked, but it was a small sound and not the kind that explained what I was seeing. Every bird hush I know, the sudden stop of night jitters when a hawk passes, had happened before those lights appeared. The crickets had thinned to nothing. I realized then that I could not hear Maya's laugh on the wind, didn't hear Tom's footfall, and that the dark, which had been full and healthy, had gone thin and very close. My headlamp sat unused, a weight against my chest. I told myself to flick it on. I told myself to call out, "Maya, Tom, you there?" Those things make sound, though, and sound is final. I kept quiet and crept forward, because curiosity has a gravity I can't seem to resist even when common sense says to go back. The lights reacted. They did the thing animals do when you make a small movement they can understand. A dart, a collective twitch, and they rose. They rose not like light tied to a body, but like little living points that could choose a path through the air. They scattered up between the tree crowns, a flock of sparrows stacking and twisting, and then, sudden and silent as paper on a breeze, they stopped. They hung there, midair, maybe 50 feet above the trail, arranged in no pattern I could name. Some were in a tight little cluster like a child holding bunches of stars. Some were spaced out like notes on a sheet of music. They didn't flicker. They didn't sink. They didn't move at all. The moon washed through them and turned the bark of the pines silver. The lights had a steady, honeyed glow that neither burned nor reflected. I must have been holding my breath because my lungs stung and the fog of it rolled out in a white puff. My hand went, without my thinking, to my phone in my pocket. It was cold. The screen woke and showed me the lock screen with the time, 11:42, and no notifications. My compass app, the crude digital arrow I'd used more for fun than navigation, spun a lazy half-turn and stopped, showing north in the wrong direction. My watch read a different minute. The second hand quivered. These are small, stupid things, the kind of details you notice only because your mind is desperate for something to explain the big thing. I put the phone back, unused. Then the lights winked off. Not all at once. One would go dark, like a bulb being twisted, and then another and another. The pattern was almost casual, like eyelids blinking. When the third light went, that mid-air hush felt even deeper. I remember thinking absurdly that I could still see the moon and the stars, that the sky was ordinary enough, and that made the things dangling between the branches seem more unnatural than they might otherwise have been. One by one, they blinked out until there was nothing left but the moon and the quiet and my own breath. It was so immediate and mundane in its ending that for a second I was annoyed. Annoyance has a way of filling the slot left by fear. It feels sturdier. I called out then, a small, stupid human sound, "Hey!" and the echo came back thinner than my voice. I stood there until my legs felt numb. I thought of turning on my headlamp and walking back to camp, of calling Maya or Tom, but my hands were lead. I told myself that whatever had been there had gone, and that was, if not an explanation, at least a closure. I walked forward to the place where the lights had been and kicked at the soft duff of needles with the toe of my boot. There was nothing, of course. No scorch, no residue, no sign that light had been hung on the night. Just the usual damp leaves and a little offended beetle scrambling away. When I reached the clearing where the creek runs, I found Maya and Tom sitting on an upturned log, their headlamps off, faces pale with worry. "We heard you call," Maya said. She had been down by the water when I slowed, she said, and thought I had turned back. Tom's pack lay open with a map peeking out. They'd seen nothing. When I asked them to explain what I'd seen, they shrugged the way people do when they want to be reasonable and keep living. "Maybe fireflies?" Tom offered. It might have been simpler if they'd seen it too. There's an easy unanimity to a shared oddity. But they hadn't, and their suggestion felt thin. We hiked back the way we had come in a loose, silent line, each of us moving on a different small current of thought. The trail that night was the trail that had always been there. Roots, stones, a place where once my boot had slipped and I'd landed with a scraped palm. Familiar, ordinary. As we walked, a dog barked somewhere in the distance, and the sound cracked like relief. At home later, in the pale hum of my kitchen light, I scrubbed at my boots and thought about the lights hanging in the trees. I found fragments of explanation in every mundane thing, reflections, pranksters, some atmospheric oddity, and none of them sat right. There was no evidence to show, no photograph on my camera, no burned spot in the bark. When I looked at the place where the lights had been, in memory, it was like trying to stare at a face you'd seen once in a crowd. The outline stayed, but the detail leached away the more you moved in. I made coffee, the kettle clicking single notes, and waited to see if the memory would feel ordinary in the light of day. It didn't exactly. It sat like a small stone in my shoe, not injuring, only present, always noticed. I was out on the deck behind my cousin's cabin in northern Maine, trying to get a few long exposure shots of the Milky Way. It was late September, around 11 p.m., and cold enough that my breath showed in the air. The cabin sits on the edge of a small lake, maybe 20 minutes outside a town that barely has a gas station, so the light pollution is almost zero. The only light was from the stars, the glow of my camera's display, and a porch bulb I'd turned off before starting. I'd brought my tripod, a thermos of coffee, and a folding chair. The plan was simple: take a bunch of long exposures, see what I got, maybe try for a time-lapse later. My cousin Jamie had already gone to bed. He works early and didn't feel like sitting in the cold just to stare at the sky. The night was calm. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. It felt like the kind of silence where you start hearing your own heartbeat if you sit still long enough. Every so often a loon called somewhere across the lake, but otherwise, it was dead quiet. I'd been out there about 40 minutes when it happened. My camera was facing southwest, catching a patch of sky that had Orion low on the horizon. I was maybe halfway through a 20-second exposure when, out of nowhere, I saw a streak of light in the sky. Bright white, but not blinding. It cut diagonally downward for about 2 seconds, then made a perfect instant 90-degree turn to the left and shot horizontally until it disappeared. There was no curve, no arc. It was like it hit an invisible wall and just changed direction. The speed didn't change. No sound at all. I froze, hands gripping the armrests of my chair, watching the spot where it vanished. I remember thinking it must have been a meteor, except meteors don't turn like that. And planes, well, planes definitely don't. I didn't stop the exposure early. I let it finish, figuring the streak would be caught in the frame. I didn't even check the display right away, partly because I didn't want to mess up my night vision, partly because I kept looking at the sky in case it came back. I took maybe 5 or 6 more shots over the next half hour. Nothing else strange. Eventually, I packed up and went inside. The cabin was warm from the wood stove, but I remember feeling like my hands wouldn't warm up right away, like the cold had gotten in deep. I poured the last of my coffee and started going through the photos on my laptop. When I got to the shot that should have had the streak, it wasn't there. The stars looked fine, the framing was exactly where I'd left it, but the sky was empty. No streak, no faint blur, nothing. The shots before and after were the same. At first, I thought maybe I'd bumped the tripod and it ruined the exposure, but the stars weren't streaked at all. No shake, no motion blur. I checked the timestamp. It was exactly when I'd seen it. I zoomed in, checked every inch of the image. Still nothing. I sat there for a while, running through explanations. Maybe it was too fast to register, but a plane's blinking light would show, and satellites leave long trails in exposures like that. I even thought maybe I'd hallucinated it, but it was too clean, too geometric. Jamie got up to use the bathroom and saw me staring at the laptop. I told him what happened, showed him the photos. He's not the type to joke about this stuff. He just frowned and said, "Weird," then went back to bed. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I went back out on the deck to see if maybe something physical had caused it, like a light reflecting off the lens from a boat on the lake or a car far off. But the line of sight was completely blocked by trees and the shore. From where I was sitting, there was no way a light source from the ground could have moved like that in the sky. That day was cloudy, so I couldn't try shooting again. But that night, I set up in the exact same spot with the same framing. I stayed out longer, almost 2 hours, just waiting. Around 12:30 a.m., I saw something again, but this time it wasn't as bright. A pale, almost gray light, like a dim star, drifted slowly across the same patch of sky. Then it stopped, just stopped moving. I stared at it, thinking maybe it was a satellite that just happened to appear stationary for a bit, but then it darted upward in a short burst before vanishing. Not fading, just gone, like someone flipped a switch. I checked the camera right away this time. Nothing in the frame. Again, the stars looked fine, no blur, no bright spots, nothing. At that point, I decided I didn't want to be outside anymore. Back inside, I tried to find anything online about lights over the lake. Satellites, space junk, even military aircraft. Nothing matched what I'd seen. The weirdest part came later that week. I'd driven back home and was showing the photos to a friend who's into astronomy. I didn't tell him what I'd seen, just handed him the shots and asked what he thought of them. He flipped through them, then stopped on the one from the first night. "This one's odd," he said, and pointed at a small, faint dot near the bottom corner of the frame. I hadn't noticed it. It looked like a dim star. But when he zoomed in, it wasn't round. It was more like a tiny, perfect triangle. I still have no idea what it was. The raw file has it, so it's not a compression glitch. But that triangle shape isn't in any of the other shots before or after, and it's nowhere near where I'd seen the streak. It's been a few years since that night. I've been back to the cabin a handful of times, always with my camera, but I've never seen anything like it again. Still, I catch myself staring at that same patch of sky when it's clear, just in case. I was heading home late one night in early September when I saw the flash of headlights bouncing off the field along County Road 17. The corn there was tall, the stalks heavy with nearly ripe ears, but something about the way the light hit it caught my eye. When I slowed, I could make out the cop's cruiser parked on the side, lights off, and yellow tape running across the road. Curious, I pulled over. 2 officers were standing near the field, talking quietly. One of them was young, maybe in his first year of patrol, and the other looked older, with a tight jaw and a sun-weathered face. I stayed back in my car at first, watching. Between the headlights and the street lamp from the small intersection, I could see the field clearly. The corn had been pressed down in a perfect circle, almost like someone had stepped in with a giant stencil. I didn't hear the officers until the older one spoke. "Keep the line tight. Tight. Don't let anyone through until morning." The younger one nodded, holding a flashlight like he wasn't sure what he was looking for. They strung the tape across a wide perimeter and then stood back, peering into the flattened wheat. I couldn't see the detail from the road, but it was precise. Every stalk bent at the same angle, pointing inward, forming a perfect ring. I didn't know why I felt drawn to it, but I got out of the car. The night was warm and damp, the kind that leaves your shirt sticking to your back. Crickets were loud, the air thick, and the smell of wet earth hung low. I stayed behind the tape, but close enough to see the stalks bending into the center. There was a sound too, faint at first, like a hum under the wind. I thought maybe it was the road, but when a car passed, it didn't get louder. "People keep saying these things are prankers," the younger officer muttered, almost to himself. "Kids with boards or ropes or whatever." The older officer shook his head. "Not like this. Not ever." He crouched at the edge of the circle, shining his flashlight across the stalks. "See the edges? No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing." I stayed a little while longer, mostly to watch. At some point I leaned against my car, squinting at the field. Then I noticed it, a thin line of fog curling along the ground inside the circle. It wasn't the fog from the road. It was contained, hovering just above the flattened stalks. I blinked. It didn't move like wind would move fog. It seemed to pulse, almost. I shook my head, thinking I was imagining things. The officers didn't notice it, busy examining the circle. I left after 10 minutes, figuring I'd get a closer look in the morning. Next day, I passed by on my way to work. That same stretch of road was lined with people now, curious locals and a few reporters with cameras. I slowed to see the field. And that's when my stomach dropped. The circle had grown. Not just a little. It looked like it had expanded by 20 feet in diameter overnight. The edges were just as perfect as the previous night. Nothing appeared disturbed. No stalks bent in the wrong direction, no footprints, just a larger version of the same pattern. The cops were still there, scratching their heads. The young officer kept looking at his notebook, muttering about measurements. The older one didn't say much, just stared at the expanded circle, lips tight. Briscoe, the farmer's old hound from down the road, had come out too. The dog stayed at the edge of the tape, growling low, ears back. Every once in a while, he would sit, staring at the center like he knew something we didn't. I walked closer, keeping my distance. The hum I'd noticed the night before was stronger now. It wasn't loud, more of a vibration you felt in your chest and teeth. I held my phone out to check the time and noticed the battery was dropping unusually fast, almost 5% in 30 seconds. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was the cold, even though it wasn't cold. One of the reporters asked the older officer if anyone had stepped inside. He shook his head. Nobody. I measured everything myself this morning. No disturbances. Not a mark. I wandered around the edge for a while. The flattened stalks gave off a strange scent, like charred wood and something sweet I couldn't place. I leaned down and touched one. The stalk bent easily under my fingers, then sprung back slightly, not completely upright, just enough to move against the others. The movement seemed alive, subtle, coordinated. People were taking photos, walking up to the line, leaning over to get a better shot. Briscoe didn't bark this time, just stayed on the perimeter, that low growl rumbling in his throat when someone crossed too close. By noon, the crowd had thinned. The sun was high, shining harshly on the field. I stayed until early afternoon, standing on the road, watching the cops. They'd brought a measuring tape and some survey markers, trying to map the expanded circle. Every time they moved a marker into the circle, the hum seemed to shift pitch. I told myself I was imagining it, but my chest tightened each time. That evening, I drove past again on the way home. The circle hadn't changed further, but it looked different in the light of the setting sun. Shadows made the spirals more pronounced, almost three-dimensional. I kept thinking I saw shapes moving within it, but every time I blinked, nothing was there. Just rows of corn bent flat. I didn't stop. I didn't want to get close after dark. But I could feel the pull, the curiosity. I thought about it all night. The next day, I passed by again. The circle hadn't expanded any further. The hum was gone. At least I didn't notice it from the road. Briscoe was nowhere in sight. People had mostly stopped coming by, and the cops had left, leaving the tape hanging loosely across the road. I haven't been back since then. Every time I drive past that stretch of road, I glance across the field. The circle is still there, in my memory at least. Perfect edges, stalks bent the same way. Inexplicable. I can't explain the growth, the hum, the feeling when you're near it. It wasn't frightening in the way of monsters or shadows. It was just wrong, subtle, precise, and completely beyond anything I can rationalize. The thing is, I know someone or something was inside that pattern. I just don't know how it got there or why it grew, and I don't think anyone else really knows either. I was in the kitchen just past midnight, leaning against the counter with a mug of instant coffee, when it happened. The house was quiet except for the old refrigerator humming in the corner, the kind of hum that makes you think you're imagining other sounds. Then I heard it, static. Full, crackling, rushing static like a storm on AM, but it was coming from the radio on the shelf. Only the radio wasn't plugged in. The cord trailed limply over the edge, and I'd been staring at it for 10 minutes before it happened. I froze, coffee halfway to my mouth, staring at the black plastic box that should have been dead. I muttered, "No way," out loud, and the static swelled a little louder, then softened like it was breathing. My first thought was a hallucination, too much caffeine, stress from work, but the sound was persistent, full-bodied, and real enough to make my teeth hurt a little. I set the mug down, trying to rationalize, and the sound stopped abruptly. Dead silence. Nothing except the refrigerator. I went to the window above the sink out of habit, looking at the dark field beyond the yard. It's just a flat pasture, a line of trees at the far end, nothing remarkable, nothing with lights except the occasional distant farmhouse. That's when I saw it, a soft, pulsing glow, low to the ground, moving slowly across the field. It was pale white, almost gray, like a diluted flashlight, and it seemed to breathe, fading and brightening in a rhythm that matched nothing natural I'd seen before. When I blinked, it had shifted slightly farther along, smooth, deliberate, unhurried, without the wobble of any drone or animal lantern. I knew. I opened the window for a better look, the cold night air brushing my face. The sound came back, low at first, like the static was echoing across the field itself. I swore the pulses of light and the rise and fall of the sound were synchronized. Light brightens, static peaks, then both fade. I leaned closer, gripping the windowsill, trying to see what it was. There was no discernible shape, just that glow drifting across the grass, silent except for the eerie accompaniment of static. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture, mostly to prove I wasn't losing it. The screen came back black. I tried the camera again, moved to the doorway, and the static seemed to follow me, like the house itself was humming with it, even though the radio still sat unplugged. My ears felt strained. The sound wasn't piercing, but it carried weight, a density that made me tense. Then it stopped. Everything stopped. The glow blinked out, the static vanished, and even the refrigerator seemed quieter. I rubbed my eyes and stepped back. Maybe I'd imagined it, the old brain playing tricks after a long day, but the field looked different somehow. Lighter at the edges, almost damp with something I couldn't place. I tried to shake the feeling. I poured the rest of the coffee, muttering that it was nothing. I sat at the counter and waited. The static returned, fainter this time, almost hesitant, and then vanished again without the light accompanying it. I noticed the clock. 15 minutes had passed in a blur. When I looked at the window again, the glow returned. Same pulsing rhythm, drifting across the field in slow, smooth arcs. My heart picked up, but I kept reminding myself it had to be something explainable. A flashlight, a car, a neighbor's work light. But the field was empty. I opened the back door quietly, stepping out onto the porch to get a better look. The air smelled sharp, dry, like the night had been scrubbed clean of everything else. I crept to the edge of the yard. The glow moved silently, never touching the trees, never flickering from wind or leaves. My phone rang out of nowhere, a text I didn't recognize, no number, just a string of nonsense characters. I stared at it and dropped the phone, feeling my pulse spike. By the time I bent to pick it up, the light had vanished and the static died again, leaving nothing but the normal hum of the world. I went back inside, doors locked, lights dim. I tried to explain it to myself, maybe some kind of electrical interference, maybe a prank, maybe a strange reflection. Nothing accounted for the timing, the rhythm, or the way it seemed aware of me being out there. I couldn't shake the sensation that it had paused, watching, waiting, testing how I'd react. I sat down with a notebook and started jotting details, times, duration, intensity, everything I could remember. Every time I looked up, the field seemed normal, mundane, yet I knew it wasn't. There was an afterimage, a residue of motion, like the night remembered something I didn't. Sleep came eventually, fitful and shallow. I woke around 4 a.m., checked the window, the field empty, the world silent except for the refrigerator. I walked through the house, every door, every light switch, double-checking. Everything normal, unremarkable, mundane. By morning, I could almost convince myself it was a dream. Almost. But the radio? The unplugged radio sat on the shelf, still and black, no power, no cord anywhere attached. And for days after, whenever I passed it, the memory of that pulsing light and the accompanying static made me pause. I went back to the porch at night, looked at the field, but nothing appeared. No glow, no static, nothing but the wind in the grass and the distant low hum of traffic far away. I thought about telling someone, anyone, but what could I say? A pulsing light, static from an unplugged radio, a field that felt alive. The words sounded crazy even in my head, so I kept it to myself. Sometimes late, I'll catch a shimmer at the edge of my vision, a blink too quick for a star. I'll check the radio out of habit. Plugged in or not, the static is gone now, but I can swear the silence feels different. Waiting. Patient. And some nights, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear it. Soft, low, just at the edge of hearing, like a signal I can't quite tune. I was driving back from town around 11 on a Friday night, headed home along the old county road outside of Cedar Ridge. It had rained earlier, so the air was heavy and thick, fog settling low over the fields. My truck's headlights barely cut through it. Sarah, my girlfriend, was asleep in the passenger seat, curled up under a blanket. Max, our German Shepherd, was stretched out across the back. I slowed as we passed our property. Something made me glance over the cornfield beside the farmhouse, and I froze. There were lights hovering above the field, pale and white, moving in a way that made no sense. Not blinking like planes, not in straight lines. They drifted, paused, shifted, almost like they were examining the field from a few feet off the ground. Max stirred, low growl vibrating in his throat. "Sarah, wake up," I said quietly, shaking her shoulder. She rubbed her eyes, groaning, but then followed my gaze out the window. What is that?" she whispered. I had no answer. We just watched in silence. The lights didn't make any sound. No hum, no crackle, nothing. Max sat up suddenly, hackles raised, staring at the same spot. He started whining softly, pacing in the back. Then he barked, short and sharp, but wouldn't leave the truck. Every time I opened the door to step out, he backed away, teeth showing, low growl. I thought about calling someone, the sheriff maybe, but what would I say? "There's lights over my field that aren't airplanes or drones." I didn't even know if I'd sound crazy. I grabbed my camera out of the glove compartment and snapped a few photos through the windshield, but the lights were blurry, stretching into faint arcs. It looked like long exposures or something. By the time the fog started thinning a little, the lights were gone. I checked my watch, midnight. Sarah tried to call Max, who wouldn't stop whining at the field. Eventually, I gave up and went inside, locking the doors behind me. Max stayed near the doorway, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the field. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I drifted off, I heard faint tapping, like someone walking in the corn just beyond the edge of the field. By dawn, I convinced myself it was just the wind or my imagination. The next morning, I stepped outside to get the paper. The cornfield looked different. There was a circle, perfectly formed, right where the lights had hovered, stalks bent over cleanly, all pointing outward, snow and dew clinging to them. Max immediately bolted back to the house, barking at the formation from the edge of the field, refusing to step closer. Sarah came out after coffee, saw the circle, and said nothing at first. She just stared. "That's new," she said finally. I nodded, still holding my coffee, trying to make sense of it. We circled the edge of the field cautiously. I touched the stalks. They were cold but strangely dry, not damp from the fog or dew. The ground beneath was firm, no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. I measured the diameter roughly with my steps. Perfect circle. My camera was useless. The image came out washed with light, like the circle itself was glowing faintly in the photos. Max refused to enter. He kept pacing at the edge, growling softly. I tried coaxing him, clapping my hands, calling his name. Nothing. The circle seemed to hold him at bay. Sarah tried to step in, but her knees wobbled a little. She laughed nervously, but there was tension in her voice. We stayed out there for maybe 20 minutes, took a few more pictures, and left him howling at the edge. I called the county extension office later in the morning. A couple of neighbors had seen it too. None of them saw the lights the night before. No one had any idea how it had formed so quickly, or why the corn was bent so precisely. Over the next few days, Max wouldn't go near the field at all. He'd pace along the fence line, whining, sometimes sitting with his back to the circle and watching the house. Sarah and I didn't talk much about it, just kept an eye on him. The circle didn't change, didn't expand or shrink, but every morning it looked different somehow. Sharper edges, stalks bent slightly differently, though I couldn't explain why. I went back one evening just after sunset to get some better pictures. The sky was clear, a cold breeze running across the field. The circle seemed ordinary at first, but as I stood there, I noticed movement, tiny flickers in the periphery of my vision. Shadows, maybe, or light reflecting oddly. Then a soft humming started, almost imperceptible, like it was coming from the ground itself. My hands went cold. I took a step back, and the humming stopped. I didn't stay long after that. Max barked from the house again, short and urgent. I got back to the truck and drove off, uneasy but safe. For weeks, I kept an eye on it from the porch. The circle never changed in size, but sometimes in the late afternoon, I thought I could see faint, almost imperceptible ripples across the stalks, like the air above them was moving differently. Sarah swore she could hear the hum at night too, faint but consistent, only when standing near the edge. The strangest part is, every time I think about going back to the circle, my stomach knots. It feels wrong, like it doesn't belong here, like it's watching. Max still won't step foot in the field, even months later. He circles the edge, stares at it, growling occasionally. I haven't told anyone else about the lights or the humming or the way the field seems different when you stand near it. People just see the circle and shrug, but we know. We feel it. The field doesn't feel empty, and the circle doesn't feel like just bent corn. Something was there that night, hovering above, shaping it somehow. Something that left its mark before disappearing entirely. I stay inside after dark now, watch the field from the porch with Max at my side. I don't know if it will ever happen again, but I've learned not to trust the quiet. The circle is still there, untouched, glowing faintly under the moonlight, while my dog growls softly at it from the safety of the edge. I was cutting through a stretch of back road between Kayenta and Page, real empty country, red rock and dust, nothing but scrub and sky. It was late afternoon, but the sun was dropping fast behind the cliffs, turning everything orange and long-shadowed. I'd left Phoenix that morning and figured I'd stop for gas in Page, maybe grab a room if I got tired. The GPS had routed me onto this weird, narrow highway, State Route 98. It wasn't a road I'd ever taken, but it seemed faster than going around. My signal had cut out an hour earlier, but the map was still loaded, so I just kept going. I hadn't seen another car for a good 30 miles, not one. No billboards, no gas stations, no fences, just mesas and sand. It was almost peaceful until it wasn't. I first noticed it when I came over a rise and dipped into this shallow canyon. The road curved, then ran straight for a long stretch between two ridges. I checked my rear view, habit, I guess, and saw headlights, 2 of them. Close. I hadn't passed anyone. There were no turnoffs, no lights behind me for hours. But now, clear as day, someone was following me. I slowed down a little to let them catch up, thinking maybe it was a ranger or a local. But the lights kept the same distance, not gaining, not falling back, just there. I tapped my brakes a few times. Nothing. They didn't flash theirs or react in any way. The weirdest thing was I couldn't see the car, just the lights. Bright, like high beams, but not blinding. They didn't bounce or shift like headlights usually do when someone's hitting bumps or small hills. They just floated there. Same height, same spacing, same brightness. Too steady. After a few miles of this, I figured maybe it was just a trick of the road. Maybe there was a truck on a different highway behind me, and the angle made it look like it was tailing me. I decided to pull over and let it pass. There was a gravel shoulder wide enough to stop, so I eased onto it, threw on my hazards, and waited. The lights kept coming. But here's the thing. When I looked in the side mirror, I didn't see anything. The rear view still showed the lights, but the side mirror, just empty desert. I even leaned out the window a little to check. Nothing there. That's when I realized there was no road behind me. Not anymore. I swear to God, I'd just been driving that same stretch. Asphalt, yellow lines, the whole deal. But when I look back now, it was just scrub and rock. No pavement, no tire marks, just open land. I thought maybe I'd turned without noticing, like there'd been a split in the road. But no, my tires were still on asphalt. I even opened the door and stepped out. The wind was picking up, carrying that dry, hot smell you only get out there. I walked a few feet behind the car. No road. It didn't make sense. I should have been able to see it stretching back at least a few hundred feet, but it just wasn't there. It looked like the road started right under my back tires and didn't exist before that. I walked back to the driver's side and checked the mirror again. Still lights, still behind me. I climbed back in and started driving again. Not fast, just steady. I watched the mirror the whole time. The lights didn't follow. They stayed in the same spot. Then, after about 5 minutes, they were gone. No fade, no curve in the road to hide them, just gone. I didn't feel relief. I felt watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder even though I knew nothing was there. Another few miles passed, the sun was nearly down now, and the whole desert looked flat and gray. That's when my headlights flickered. Once, twice, then stayed on. I tapped the dash, probably just a loose wire, I figured. The rental had been making a weird sound since I picked it up. A minute later, the engine made this soft whining noise like it was straining. RPMs dipped. The whole car jerked once, then smoothed out. That's when I saw movement up ahead. Something crossed the road. Quick, low to the ground. I only caught it in my peripheral vision. Might have been a coyote, but it didn't move like one. It didn't run. It sort of glided. I slowed down to look, but there was nothing. No prints, no shape disappearing into the brush. The air felt weird, heavy. Not hot anymore, just thick. Then the static started. It came through the speakers, even though the radio was off. Just a low hiss, barely noticeable, but rising, like a storm was nearby. I turned the knob, nothing changed. Tried to shut the stereo off completely, but it didn't respond. The hiss kept building until it suddenly cut out. Silence. That's when I noticed the sky. It wasn't dark yet, not fully, but the stars were already out, except above me. Directly overhead, there was this perfect circle of empty sky. No stars, just blank. It didn't look like a cloud. It was too precise, too still. I kept driving. A mile or two later, I saw lights again, but not behind me this time, off to the side, maybe half a mile out, floating low over the desert. Two of them, close together, moving slow. I figured it might be a drone or a tower, but then they split. One went left, one went right. Both rose at the same time, then dropped in sync, then vanished. I pulled over again. I needed to breathe. When I stepped out, I noticed this faint humming. Not from the car, from the air. It was high-pitched and constant, like the sound you hear when a TV's on in another room. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, and then I heard something behind me. A soft crunch. I spun around. Nothing. Another crunch. Closer. I didn't see anything, but I swear something was moving through the brush, just out of sight. I got back in the car and locked the doors, took off down the road faster than I probably should have. Eventually, I saw a sign for Page, still about 20 miles out. The road widened a bit, and I started seeing the occasional fence post or light in the distance. Civilization creeping back in. The second I hit town limits, everything stopped. The static, the humming, the weird pressure in the air. I pulled into a gas station and sat in the lot for 10 minutes before getting out. Just stared at the lights, the other people, the pavement. Normal things. I looked behind me. The road was there, plain as day. 2 lanes, yellow stripes, tire marks, everything. But I checked the car's trip meter. The mileage didn't line up with where I should have been. I should have driven about 130 miles that day. The meter said 89. I woke up at 2:13 a.m. because of the dogs. They usually don't bark at night unless something's really off. We get coyotes now and then, but they'll yap and pace if that's the case. This was different. Short, clipped barks, then silence, then one of them let out this weird half growl, half whimper, like it didn't know whether to be afraid or aggressive. I got up, put on my boots without socks, grabbed the flashlight off the windowsill. I live on 38 acres about 20 minutes outside of Mason City, Iowa. It's mostly pasture, with a little patch of timber on the north end, barn on the east side, house tucked back from the gravel drive. No neighbors in sight, just sky and corn and cows. When I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No crickets, no wind. Even the trees behind the barn weren't moving. It was dead still. I aimed the flashlight toward the paddock where the cattle usually huddled together at night. They weren't there. Then I saw the glow. Not from the barn itself, above it, hanging maybe 50, 60 feet over the roof. It was white, but not like a spotlight or a floodlight. It pulsed. Not fast, but steady, on, off. Each pulse about 3 seconds apart. No beam, just the glow hanging there like a jellyfish suspended in the air. I turned off my flashlight and just watched. I didn't move for what felt like a minute, maybe longer. The air had that charged feeling, like right before a thunderstorm, but there were no clouds. Just stars behind that pulsing white light. Then I noticed the cows. They were in the front pasture, just past the gravel. I hadn't seen them at first because of the hill between the yard and the drive. All 23 of them, standing in a perfect circle. Perfect. Equal spacing between each one, every single one of them facing outward, away from the center, toward the fields. Heads up. Still. I walked closer. They didn't react to me. No shifting, no snorting, just statues. My flashlight was still off, but the glow from the thing above the barn lit the scene better than any full moon. Their shadows stretched long and thin across the ground, all pointed outward in that same circle shape. I don't remember making a decision to move, but I found myself walking down the gravel toward the barn. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't scared exactly, more like confused, out of step with things. Like the timing was wrong. When I got closer to the barn, the light above it pulsed faster. Still silent, no humming, just this soft, thick on-off rhythm like breathing. I got within maybe 20 yards before something in my head just shut off. Not sleep, not passing out. It felt like someone skipping ahead in a video. I blinked and I was standing in the same place except the light was gone. Just black sky now. No pulsing. No movement. And I was cold. Really cold. I looked down at my flashlight. It was still in my hand, but the rubber grip was covered in dew. My shirt was damp. The toes of my boots were soaked. I walked back to the house. My legs felt stiff, like I'd been standing for hours. The dogs were inside, both curled up behind the wood stove. They didn't get up when I came in. I looked at the wall clock. It said 8:24. I checked my wristwatch. 8:24. It had said 2:13 when I got up. That whole chunk of time, 6 hours, just gone. I hadn't gone inside, hadn't sat down, hadn't done anything but walk from the porch to the pasture. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while the sun started to rise. I could still see the cows. They hadn't moved. Same circle, same stance. Around 8:45, they broke off one by one. No noise, no panic, just walking away like nothing had happened. By 9, they were all grazing again like normal. I went out and checked the barn. Nothing out of place. Tools on the hooks, feed bin shut, no burn marks on the roof or the ground. But the grass where the circle had been, where the cows stood, was matted down. Not trampled, just flat, even, like it had been pressed. I didn't tell anybody that day. A week later, I noticed something else. My watch was running 6 hours fast every morning. Only in the morning. I'd reset it, wear it all day, check it before bed, fine. But when I woke up, it would be 6 hours ahead. Exactly 6. Not 5 and change, not drifting. Just skipped forward. I stopped wearing it. Eventually, I sold the cows. Couldn't look at them the same. They'd line up along the fence sometimes and just stare toward the barn at dusk. I keep the pasture empty now, just hay. Nothing else has happened since, but I've taped over the clock in the kitchen. I don't like seeing that time. We were hiking out past Queen City Summit, near the edge of the Nevada Test and Training Range. Not on the base itself, obviously, but close enough that the signs got real serious. Bright yellow metal ones with warnings about deadly force and hidden sensors. We weren't trying to mess with anything. We just wanted to camp for a couple nights, stargaze, maybe catch a glimpse of something weird. It was me, my cousin Tyler, and his friend Marco. Tyler's a machinist in Sacramento, real into aerospace stuff. Marco's a little more of a conspiracy guy, flat brim hat, infrared scope, the whole deal, but mostly harmless. I'm not really into that scene, but I like hiking and I had a long weekend, so I figured why not. We parked off a dirt road east of Rachel, hiked in about 6 miles along a dry wash. It was early March, chilly but not freezing. No clouds, no moon, just a thick canopy of stars. We set up camp behind a rock formation that blocked most of the wind, built a little fire, cooked sausages and canned beans. Just a normal desert night. Around 11 p.m., Marco started scanning the sky with his monocular. Tyler was fiddling with a homemade antenna thing he'd built to pick up air traffic control signals. I was just lying back on my pad looking at Orion. That's when we heard it. At first I thought it was a bee, or maybe an electric fence nearby. Just a soft buzzing, kind of high-pitched but mechanical. It wasn't coming from the ground. It felt like it was in the air around us. Not loud, but steady. Tyler sat up and said, "You hear that?" Marco nodded, but didn't say anything. He was already pointing the monocular up toward the ridge behind us. I stood and looked too. At first, I didn't see anything, just stars. But then 3 of them moved. They were in a triangle shape, equal distance from each other, low in the sky. The lights were white, but not bright. Dimmer than aircraft strobes. They didn't blink, just hovered there, totally still. Then the buzzing got louder. Not dramatically, just a notch higher, like an old fluorescent bulb kicking on. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera. It wouldn't start, just froze on the loading screen. I tried backing out, tried switching to the flashlight, nothing. The screen was still lit, but no apps worked. Tyler's phone wouldn't even turn on. He held down the power button and just shook his head. "It's dead," he said, like he didn't believe it. Marco had a little hand crank flashlight. He turned it on and pointed it up, just to see if it would reflect anything. The second he did, the buzzing stopped. The triangle of lights began to drift sideways. Not fast, just a slow, deliberate glide, like it was tracking along an invisible rail. No tilt, no wobble, no trail behind it. We watched it move for maybe 20 seconds, and then it vanished. Not like it zipped away, not like it dimmed out. It just blinked off. Gone. The buzzing didn't come back. The stars looked normal again. We stood there in silence for a long time. Nobody reached for their phone again. Eventually, we sat by the fire. Nobody said much. Marco went into his tent early. Tyler just poked at the coals and kept glancing at the sky. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I checked my phone again. It was fine. Battery at 82%, apps working. Photos, flashlight, everything. I didn't sleep much that night. Next morning, Marco said he'd tried to take a picture too. Claimed his screen went green and made a clicking noise before shutting off. His phone wouldn't boot until we were halfway back to the car. We didn't report anything. Not sure who we'd report it to anyway. All I know is we saw something, and for whatever reason, none of our gear worked while it was happening. I was hiking in the Adirondacks one early fall afternoon, trying to squeeze in a day on the trail before the weather turned colder. I'd chosen a spot called Panther Gorge, not because it was popular or anything, but because it was supposed to be quiet, a little remote, and mostly untouched. I'd been hiking alone for a few hours, the sky partly cloudy with that low, gray light that makes everything feel a bit muted. About halfway through the loop, I came to a narrow stretch of woods where the trees thickened and the path narrowed to barely more than a dirt track. The usual sounds of birds or wind in the leaves were gone. Dead silence. It was strange enough to make me stop and listen, but then there was a flash, like a camera or a lightning bug, but brighter, just for a second. The light came from just off the trail, deeper in the woods. I squinted into the shadows but saw nothing. I kept moving, but the silence stuck with me. No crunching leaves underfoot, no birds calling. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound, and every time I thought I heard something, it vanished. After about 10 minutes, the trail opened up again into a small clearing near the road that led back to the trailhead parking. I was a little on edge by then, wanting to get off the trail before dark, and that's when I saw the car. It was a black sedan, the kind you see in the city, parked right there on the side of the road, engine running but no lights on. I didn't recognize the make, just a plain-looking, older model, no logos or anything. The driver's window was down and a man was sitting inside. He looked normal at first, mid-40s, clean-shaven, dark hair slicked back, wearing a black suit and white shirt with the collar open, no tie. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, but he looked right at me. I slowed down, not sure what to expect. "You okay?" he asked, voice low but clear. "Yeah, just finished the hike," I said, but my voice sounded weird in the still air. He nodded. "The forest keeps its secrets. Respect them." I stared at him, not sure how to respond. There was something about the way he said it, like it wasn't just a casual warning, but a statement with weight. "Do you mean the light? The silence back there?" I asked, gesturing vaguely toward the trees. He shook his head slowly. "Not everything is meant to be understood. Sometimes the best thing is to walk away." I wanted to ask more, but the words caught in my throat. Before I could say anything else, he closed the window, started the engine, and the car pulled away slowly, then turned onto the road and disappeared around a bend. I stood there for a while, looking after it, feeling the cold start to creep into my bones as the sun dipped lower. The silence in the woods was still with me when I got back to my car. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was back there, whatever that flash was, it wasn't just natural. I drove home that night thinking about the man, the car, and the strange quiet. Nothing about it made sense, but part of me didn't want to figure it out either. I was hauling a load from Anchorage to Fairbanks, the kind of long haul that makes your ass numb and your eyes glazed. I'd been on the road since dawn, and by the time I got near Talk, the sky had already turned that muddy gray you get in early fall up here. I figured I'd stop at the rest area just east of town to stretch and grab a bite out of my cooler. The place was empty, just me and a few crows picking at some trash near the dumpsters. I pulled my rig into one of the gravel spots, shut off the engine, and let the quiet settle in. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy in Alaska. No city hum, no distant traffic, just the wind stirring the spruce. That's when I noticed it. A white pickup parked maybe 50 yards down the road, tailgate facing me. The weird thing was there wasn't a soul behind the wheel. No headlights, no running lights, nothing to say someone was inside. At first, I figured the driver had stepped away to pee or something, but the place was dead cold and fog was rolling in fast, thick, and wet, like someone dropped a blanket over everything. I went inside my cab to get my flashlight. When I looked back out, the truck's headlights blinked on. Not steady like someone flipping the switch, but irregular, like a stuttered Morse code, on and off, on, then a longer pause. It felt deliberate. I don't know why I got out of my rig and started walking toward it. Maybe curiosity, maybe the way the light was just there, flickering like it was trying to say something. The fog made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I called out, "Hey, you here?" Nothing. The headlights blinked again, like a pulse, then stayed dark for a moment. I stopped about 10 feet from the truck. It was colder than the rest of the rest stop, like the air itself was thicker there. Then the headlights snapped back on, but this time the truck just vanished. I blinked, and it was gone. No trace in the fog, no sound of a motor revving or tires moving, just nothing. I looked around, heart thudding, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks. I checked the gravel where it had been parked. No tire marks, no disturbed dirt, nothing out of place. It was like it had never been there. I got back in my cab, slammed the door, and locked it. I called my buddy Mike back in Fairbanks, telling him I'd just seen some weird shit. He laughed it off, said maybe I was tired or the fog was messing with me. But the weirdness didn't stop there. The rest of that night, every time I looked out the window, I thought I caught a flicker of white light moving through the fog, like the outline of that truck, but never fully there. Once, the radio buzzed with static, then a faint whistle that didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. No bird, no machinery, just a long, low hum, then silence. I stayed put until dawn, watching the fog lift slowly with the first light, but no sign of that pickup or whatever it was. I made it back to Fairbanks without more incident. Since then, I keep thinking about that truck and the way it blinked at me, then disappeared like smoke. No answers, just that quiet feeling that something was out there, watching me through the fog. I was driving home late one night just outside Ashtabula when the fog started rolling in. Thick, low-hanging stuff that swallowed up the road and everything else around me. I hadn't planned on it getting that bad. One minute I was cruising along the usual stretch of Route 20 near Lake Erie, and the next, the world turned gray and dense, like someone had dumped a blanket over the whole town. My name's Dave Hollis, by the way, born and raised in this part of Ohio. I worked nights at a gas station in town, so this wasn't my first foggy drive, but this night was different. I was about 5 miles past Geneva, heading west toward home in Ashtabula, when I saw headlights coming at me through the mist. Pretty normal, right? Except the car never came close. It was like the headlights were floating in the fog, getting closer but never actually passing me. No engine sound, no tire noise on the wet road, just those two steady beams cutting through the gray. I slowed down, watching the lights. They stayed directly in front of me, maybe 100 yards away, moving like they wanted to meet me. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, hoping to give the other driver room to pass, but the lights just stopped, hanging there in the fog. I sat for a minute, staring into that murky nothing. The night was silent, except for the faint hum of my engine idling. Then, out of nowhere, something else showed up ahead. A soft glow, blue-white and kind of hazy, appeared about 50 yards down the road in the fog. It wasn't like any car light or street lamp I'd ever seen. It was just there, floating maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but the fog kept swallowing it up. Then suddenly, that glow shot straight up, like someone flipped a switch. It shot up into the sky in a smooth, fast line and disappeared into the clouds above. I swear, right after it lifted, everything went dead quiet. The usual distant sounds, crickets, cars on the highway, even the hum of my own truck, all just stopped. It was like the whole world paused for a second. I sat frozen for a long moment. Then I shut the truck off, rolled down the window, and listened. Nothing. Not a bird, not a breeze, not even the usual crackle of insects in the weeds. When I finally turned the truck back on, the headlights were gone, the fog had thinned a little, and the normal sounds of the night came creeping back. I kept driving, eyes darting to every shadow and movement in the woods beside the road. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched or like something had slipped right past me in that fog. At home, I double-checked the locks and sat for a while just staring out the window at the dark road. I still don't know what that light was or what it was doing out there, but I know I wasn't imagining the silence that followed. And if you ever find yourself driving through thick fog near Ashtabula late at night, watch those headlights closely. They might be what you think. Name's Miguel Torres. I'm from El Paso, born and raised, but I spend most weekends out hiking in the Franklin Mountains. It's a decent stretch of desert wilderness right on the edge of town, and it's quiet out there, real quiet, especially at night. You can get lost in your own thoughts or just in the dark. This one night, a couple months ago, I was out on the North Loop Trail. I usually go with a buddy, but that evening he had to bail last minute, so it was just me, my pack, and my phone, mainly for navigation and a little music while I walked. I'm not the type to hike at night often, but I figured, what the hell? It's been hotter than hell during the day, and the cool night air felt better. Anyway, I was maybe a couple miles from the trailhead near the upper ridges when I noticed something weird on the horizon. There was this soft, glowing light way out over the desert flatlands. It wasn't like the orange glow of El Paso's city lights. This was a pale, steady kind of glow, almost bluish white, but soft like a lantern behind fog or something. It didn't blink or flicker. Just there, hanging low on the horizon. I stopped and pulled out my phone to check my compass, just out of habit. The thing was spinning like crazy, needle jerking all over the place. I swear it didn't settle on any direction, just spun like it was freaking out or magnetized to some strong force. I pointed the compass away from the glow, toward the hills behind me, and it settled down quick, like nothing was wrong. I looked back at that light. It didn't move. It just hovered there. I thought maybe it was some kind of flare or a distant vehicle, but it didn't flicker or move like a car or a plane. I'm telling you, it felt unnatural. The desert was dead silent, except for the soft rustle of mesquite trees in the wind. I took a few steps forward, trying to get a better look. The compass needle started spinning again as soon as I pointed it toward the light. It was like the light was messing with the electronics or something. I checked my GPS too. It kept losing signal or acting glitchy. That had me uneasy, but I kept moving closer anyway. About 10 minutes later, that glow just faded, like someone slowly dimmed a lamp. It wasn't sudden or abrupt, just gone. The desert looked darker all of a sudden. I checked my compass again. This time, it worked just fine, steady and calm, pointing true north like normal. I stood there for a few minutes trying to figure out what I just saw. No sound, no movement, no other lights, nothing. It felt like something was watching, but there was no one there. I decided it was time to head back. The walk down was quiet. My phone worked fine again, no glitches or compass freakouts. I kept glancing back toward where that glow had been, but there was nothing. Just dark desert. When I got home, I showed Jess the spot on the map and told her about the compass acting up. She laughed and said maybe I just needed new batteries or that my phone was bugging out. But I don't think so. Since then, I've been out a few more times, but I haven't seen anything like that again. Sometimes when I'm out late, I'll catch a glimpse of a faint light or feel like something's just beyond the edge of sight, but nothing that screws with my gear like that. I don't know what it was. Could have been something natural, or maybe something else entirely. But whatever it was there, that night, messing with my compass, watching from the horizon, quiet as the desert itself. I was on the roof because the roof is the only place in my block that still has darkness enough to see anything beyond the sodium street lamps. I'd set the telescope up between the rusting HVAC units and a dying potted palm, tripod feet on the gravel, red headlamp tucked into my jacket so I wouldn't wreck my night vision. My name's Marco Reyes. I'm not an astronomer, just someone who likes to point expensive glass at empty bits of sky and try to make sense of the small things moving up there. The night was the kind of cold that sharpens edges. Late October, clear, with a thin crescent moon. I was logging the Cassiopeia sweep when my planet tracking app pinged a satellite pass. I always check satellites. They move like they're on rails. This didn't. At first I saw 4 points of light, evenly spaced, crawling across the sky as if someone had snapped a line of LEDs into place. They held formation perfectly. No drift, no jitter. Just that quiet, mechanical glide. Then they did something that made me sit back from the eyepiece because it made no sense in any of the little rhythms I knew. The formation split. Not a diffusion or a scattering like a flock of birds, but a clean break. The 4 points arranged into a square, then 2 points slotted inward to make a diamond. And suddenly one of the points folded inward on an angle so sharp it looked like the light had just stopped being a dot and was now an edge. The motion was instantaneous, like a page flipping. I blinked and the thing had changed again. Corners forming and reforming, more geometry than flight. I checked the scope for reflection, tapped the eyepiece, thought maybe an internal glitch. The live feed on my phone showed the same thing, just smaller, so it wasn't me hallucinating. I started recording because that's what you do when something refuses to behave. You make a copy, so later you can argue with it. The lights moved with that odd, clean choreography for maybe 3 minutes. They'd push in, snap apart, slide sideways without the faintest arc, vanish for a blink, and reappear a fraction of a degree away. No sound at all. The air on the roof was ordinary. Traffic down the avenue, a dog barking once, a far plane. But the motion itself had the wrong physics. Sharp turns that would tear apart any aerodynamic surface, pauses that weren't pauses but jumps. After 10 minutes, I felt stupid and small and intensely awake all at once. The sky settled back into its normal scatter. An airplane crossed with its blinking nav lights, a satellite that actually behaved like a satellite. I packed the scope away with my hands, still a little clumsy. I thumbed the recording and saw the file, the little thumbnail moving, but when I tried to open it, my phone choked. File corrupted, the media app said, which is the polite way electronics tell you you don't own the moment you thought you owned. I shrugged and went inside because it was late and because there's always the argument that rooftops have the best ghosts. The next morning I had to get up for work at the public library downtown. I've been the evening reference librarian there for 3 years. The job is mostly lending answers and shushing teenagers. Library work is sensible, which is why what happened after the roof felt strange on top of strange. I walked out of the staff entrance at 8:15 and 2 men were on the sidewalk across the street. I noticed them because the morning felt ordinary, and then the men were there. 2 dark silhouettes in suits unlike anything you see on a Tuesday outside a library. Black wool, narrow ties, shoes so clean they looked new. They were standing under the awning of a closed storefront, both staring in the exact direction of the library entrance. They weren't talking, they weren't shifting weight, they were just watching. There was something about them that made my stomach drop slow and precise. The way they held still like a camera prevents motion blur. The sameness of their posture, the way they avoided buying coffee or even pretending to check their phones. It was the way movie extras look when the director hasn't called wrap. I told myself I was being childish. Maybe they were waiting for a friend. Maybe they were private security. People wait on sidewalks all the time. I changed my route to the front door because the staff entrance was closer. But as I passed the window of the bakery across the street, I caught them out of the corner of my eye. Still there, still watching. Inside, I couldn't focus. Someone asked me where the genealogy microfilm was, and I pointed and then had to go back and look at the copy of the roof video I'd finally managed to force into existence on my backup drive. The file opened this time, but there was a single frame where the lights folded inward that was pure white, like someone had erased that instant. I scrubbed back and forth, and the white frame stayed the size of a single heartbeat. At 11, I told my supervisor I wasn't feeling well. He raised an eyebrow. People call in for colds all the time, but I could see him thinking it over and deciding the day would pass without me. When I walked back out to the staff entrance, the two men were closer now, under the plane trees by the newsstand, still staring at the library door. They hadn't budged. They didn't follow me. They didn't approach. They merely stood and watched in that slow, spectator silence until I rounded the corner and started home with my chest a little tight and the afternoon wide open. The whole way back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting them to be driving behind me the way men in suits in bad movies do. The street was empty except for a delivery van. The world had its usual noise: trains, a kid on a bicycle, someone on a lawnmower. I should have called someone. Police, a friend, a manager, but the rational options reeked a little of overreaction. Excuse me, there are two men staring at my workplace doesn't sit comfortably in the phone. Instead, I sat on my couch and tried to make sense of the white frame. I tried to find the moment again on my site clipboard, dug the backup card out of the glove box, but a day later, the file behaved differently. The recording would play up to the white frame and then, as if bored, jump forward a second and resume. Not corrupted, altered in a way that looked like someone had edited the world's continuity. Over the next 48 hours, other little things piled up around that first weirdness. My apartment clock lost 7 minutes and then caught back up. My neighbor told me her baby monitor recorded a burst of static at 2 a.m. No voice, no melody, just a thin sweep like the breath of old radio tubes. My phone battery drained faster than it had any right to. The weather app on my tablet showed rain for the afternoon the next week, and then, when I checked again, a different forecast. Small, plausible glitches, each one wearing the shape of coincidence. On Wednesday, I went back to work. I said I'd been clear-headed all morning, and meant it at first until I rounded the newsstand and the men were there again. A little further down, still in their suits and still watching the door like they were cataloging the comings and goings. A mother with a stroller paused and looked at them and then hurried away differently, like her sense of a normal morning had shifted. A bus driver swapped a look with a shopkeeper and then shrugged it off. The men kept watching. When I left early again at lunchtime, they watched me a while longer. From the sidewalk, their faces were as blank as copies. No sunglasses to hide eyes, nothing to anchor them to the rest of the city. I kept my head down and walked. The whole time I had the odd sensation that they knew which pocket held the telescope key, that they had the white frame of my video memorized like a schedule. I thought about parking across town for the evening, about sleeping at a friend's, about changing my clothes and vanishing for a night, but I didn't do any of those things. I walked home because habit is a tie. That night I tried to be ordinary. I cooked pasta, I did the dishes, I pretended the sky was the same sky. The topaz of the streetlight through the blinds looked the same as it ever did. I left a red headlamp in the drawer by the door, just in case. When I closed my eyes, the white frame was a bright, jagged thing behind my eyelids. I don't know what those lights were on the roof. I don't know who the men were on the sidewalk. I don't know whether the missing frame is a hole someone cut in time, or a bad app, or a trick of electronics colluding with my nerves. All I know is that the city felt a little watched for a while, like when you notice a new camera and can't unsee it. I also know I left work early 2 days running and that two men in suits stood across the street both times and did nothing but look until I was gone. I was on the last leg to Farmington night flight, no weather to speak of. Clear sky, moon a sliver, the kind of night that makes you think of how small everything is. I was trimmed for 5,500, autopilot engaged, a half-empty thermos chilled inside the console. The radios were quiet except for the occasional flight-following handoff and a distant cargo truck on 121.5 sounding like it was 3 counties away. It was a routine leg. I had flown it dozens of times. Out the left window, something moved into the cone of the landing light and I almost missed it, because at first it read like a star. Then it didn't. It was too close for a star. It was at about the same angle off the nose as the wingtip, maybe 5, 6 miles to the left, and I could swear it was at our altitude. It wasn't blinking, no red or green nav lights, no white strobes, just a dark, hard edge against the sky. The kind of shape that eats up starlight and holds it. At first, I told myself I was seeing traffic I hadn't expected. An unlit crop duster? A banner tow? I checked the transponder, toggled to ident, and listened for any TCAS warnings. Nothing. The EFIs showed the usual blank where traffic would display. My transponder was transmitting and the ADS-B box was showing the other traffic we'd heard earlier, so the equipment seemed to be working fine. Still, it held position relative to us like it belonged in the same lane of air. I called center, Cessna 7KQH, visual traffic, left 2 o'clock, same altitude, say intentions. The voice came back from the other side of the headset clear and practiced. 7KQH, center, roger. We show no primary or secondary target in your area. Maintain present heading and altitude. No target. Copy, I said. I double-checked the heading on the HSI, glanced at the GPS track, then looked again out the window. The object had matched my ground track and my ground speed. Not perfectly in the way 2 airplanes occasionally sit beside each other, but it kept pace as if it were glued to our velocity vector, the dark edge maintaining that impossible station next to me. I disengaged the autopilot and put the yoke over, just to feel the motion. I banked left 3 degrees to get a better look, and the thing did something I couldn't find an easy word for. It rolled. Not banked or turned, but rolled, as if gravity had loosened its hold and it turned on an axis sideways, a slow, lazy roll unlike anything an airplane normally does. It slid then, laterally, exactly opposite my bank, with a fluidity like a model in water. It never accelerated in the hard sense. There was no plume, no wake. It simply moved. We could have been a matched pair of dancers and it complicating the choreography without effort. I called center again, voice steadier than I felt. Center, 7KQH. Right now the traffic's holding exactly parallel. It's rolling away to the west. Static hummed for a moment and the controller answered. A tone I now know means they were running the scope to see primary returns. Negative, 7KQH. No targets. Are you receiving any interference? Negative on interference, I said. My headset had that small, precise noise the radios make when something is wrong, like when the squelch is being coaxed. I flipped the radio to ground to check the other frequency, confirmed the squelch, checked the standby, toggled the audio panel. Nothing. All the systems behaved normally. Pitot heat on, vacuum steady, alternator green. The clock in the panel blinked, then resumed. It was a list of ordinary things doing ordinary things, and the extraordinary thing outside doing nothing that fit. I reached for the binoculars I keep under the glare shield. They were cold and damp to the touch, like they'd been somewhere colder before I grabbed them. I held them up and got the shape. Vague, geometric, not like the rounded belly of most aircraft. The edges appeared matte, not reflecting the landing light at all, but the silhouette was crisp. I could see no windows, no tails, no prop blur. At the scales involved, I would have expected something to flicker or shimmer. There was nothing. It just existed and matched us. When I turned to take the head-on view, it did something else. I banked right and nudged the throttles to keep airspeed steady, because I didn't want to climb or descend and hand control back to the autopilot if I could help it. The object didn't follow in a straight chase. It reversed the feel of the moment by sliding away as if it had been tethered on a nearly invisible string, and someone eased it free. The roll completed like a lazy turn, and then it drifted. I'm being clumsy with words because I don't have a better one. Sideways, down the horizon. And it did it with no noise, no thermal wake, the way a whirl of smoke disperses, only in reverse. I called approach on the guard channel, told them my tail number and that I had traffic visually at 1 o'clock, matching my altitude and gliding parallel. Approach, 7KQH. Excuse me, can you verify if any aircraft are in OMA sector? They came back quick. 7KQH, negative, we have no targets on primary in that sector. We're showing your transponder and other known traffic, but nothing else. So I asked the only question that mattered. Can you show me primary? Can you physically see anything on radar that corresponds to what I'm looking at right now? If we could, the controller said, we would, 7KQH. We have nothing. Say position and distance again. I gave a guess. Pilots estimate poorly at night. Approximately 2 to 3 miles left, same altitude. It was 2 minutes of me watching it go from being a curious puzzle to not being there at all. At some point, the silhouette narrowed and brightened like a lens-bending light. I thought it might ignite, strobe, or exhaust some simple physical reveal. Instead, it tightened into a point, and then no phase change, no spray, nothing that you could point to as a mechanism. It simply winked out. One moment there was that indigo cut against the lower sky. The next, it was gone. No transit across the stars, no streak. The place where it had been was empty, like someone had lifted a birdcage. After that, all the small things unsettled in the cockpit turned larger. My watch, a cheap pilot's watch, was 5 minutes fast and then corrected itself. The thermos slid on the console for no reason when I eased back to neutral trim. My phone, which I had set to record when this started, had one file that corrupted into a single unopenable blob, and a second file that, on playback, showed 3 frames of a dark smear and then a blackness my phone described as unsupported. I told the controller I had recording and they'd mark it in the strip for the engineers, but they didn't ask for the file. They asked if I wanted to divert. I did not. There was nothing to divert to that made sense. We continued into Farmington like a ship resuming course after a passing, insignificant fog. My hands hovered a little above the yoke on the approach, as if not touching it would be safer. The wind held steady, the runway came up, and the landing was exactly the kind of wash of rightness these instruments train you for. On the ground, I taxied in slow and left the lights on, because the cabin still had that odd electric cooling I couldn't explain. I filled out the paperwork in the FBO between customers and tried to get someone to look at the files. Maintenance looked at my transponder traces and the ATC printout and at my GPS log. They found nothing out of order except one tiny anomaly in the GPS track where the ground speed showed a half-second blip. The controllers sent me the radar tape. It was clean where we'd been. This sort of thing happens sometimes at night, one of them said, like that explained anything. I didn't expect an answer. I didn't think there'd be a report. I flew home in the morning and filed the routine incident notes and told my wife an abridged version because I didn't want to hand her the thing that felt like an accusation of instability. I kept turning that empty patch of sky over in my head. When I talk about it, people look for a category: weather balloon, experimental drone, a trick of the eye. None of those fit what I saw or didn't see. If anything has changed me, it's the way I check everything twice now. The transponder, the squitter, the frequency, the wing flex, even the thermos under the glare shield. I still fly at night. It's a job and I've been doing it a long time. But when I'm on the leg to Farmington now and something dark sits where a star used to be, I call it in a little sooner. The controller on the other end will still say nothing is showing. They always do. It happened about 6 years ago, late summer, on a stretch of highway between Twin Falls and Jackpot. I was heading back to Boise after visiting an old friend who'd moved down to Nevada. It was past midnight, clear sky, no clouds, no moon, just that huge empty desert around you on all sides. Traffic was light, one of those drives where you pass the same handful of cars over and over again because everybody's doing the same speed. There was a dark blue Chevy Silverado that kept leapfrogging me, a red Corolla with a missing hubcap, and a couple semis farther back. That was pretty much it. I remember glancing at the clock around 12:45. I had the radio low, just trying to keep myself alert. Out of nowhere, my headlights dimmed. Not flickered, dimmed like someone had put a tinted screen over them. The dashboard lights followed. The engine gave a low stutter, like when you're about to stall out in first gear. I thought it was just me until I noticed the red Corolla ahead of me, rolling slower, then drifting to the shoulder. The Silverado's brake lights came on, then faded as if the whole truck was losing juice. Both cars coasted to a stop. My engine coughed once, and then silence. No radio, no headlights, nothing. It was eerie how quickly the whole road went dark. 1 second, you've got beams of light cutting through the desert. The next, it's just pitch black. The only sound was gravel crunching under my tires as I steered to the shoulder. I sat there gripping the wheel, waiting for the engine to kick back, but it stayed dead. I tried the key a couple times. Nothing. No click, no turnover. That's when I noticed it. Over the highway, maybe 150 feet up, there was a shape hanging in the air. At first I thought it was a cloud catching starlight, but the sky was totally clear. It wasn't solid exactly, but it wasn't formless either. A kind of pale oval, glowing faintly, just suspended there like it was pinned to the sky. It didn't move, didn't pulse, didn't make a sound. I opened my door and stepped out. The desert was dead quiet, no crickets, no wind. Just me and the faint crunch of gravel under my boots. The other drivers were getting out too. The guy from the Corolla leaned against his door, looking up. The Silverado driver, a tall guy in a baseball cap, stood in the middle of the road with his arms crossed like he was trying to act unbothered. One of the semis had rolled to a stop a little farther back, and I could see the driver's flashlight beam sweeping around his cab. Nobody said anything at first. We all just stared at that thing. I kept expecting to hear some kind of hum or engine noise, but there was nothing. It just hung there. And the longer I looked at it, the harder it was to pin down its shape. Some moments it looked circular, other moments stretched out, like it shifted when you weren't directly focusing on it. After a while, could have been 30 seconds, could have been 10 minutes, I honestly couldn't tell, the oval began to move. Not fast, just a slow, smooth drift off to the west over the desert. Still no sound, still glowing faintly. We all watched as it slipped farther away until it was just a dim smudge against the stars, and then gone. The moment it disappeared, my headlights snapped back on. The radio came alive mid-song. The Corolla's taillights lit up again. The Silverado rumbled as its engine restarted. It was almost too much at once, like every car had been waiting for the same cue. The guy in the baseball cap muttered something I couldn't catch, got back in his truck, and pulled onto the road like nothing happened. The Corolla followed. The semi behind us roared back to life. Nobody waved, nobody talked, everyone just drove off. I sat there a minute longer, letting my hands stop shaking before I pulled back onto the highway. The strangest part was how normal the drive felt afterward. No more flickering, no more stalling, just empty road and the stars above. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that glow again, but the sky stayed clear. When I got home, I realized I couldn't account for how long I'd been stopped. The trip should have put me back in Boise around 3. I didn't walk in my door until after 4:30. I've never run into anything like it since. It was a sharp, metallic clicking that woke me. One loud, precise clack against the window frame that sounded nothing like the usual neighborhood noises. My phone said 2 a.m. when I thumbed the screen and then went dark. The screen had no notifications, but the house felt wrong in a way I couldn't place. I sat up and listened. The clicking came again. 2 quick taps, evenly spaced, like someone testing the latch on the neighbor's shed. June, my tabby, uncurled and flattened herself against my chest, eyes 2 tiny moons in the dark. She didn't hiss or bolt, just stayed still and tense. That sealed it for me. Whatever it was, whatever noise had come from outside, the cat felt it too. I pulled the blinds aside an inch and looked down. The street was almost empty. A couple of parked cars, street lamp 3 houses down throwing the usual pool of sodium orange, the silhouette of Mrs. Duval's maple at the corner. But there was a pale light hanging in the air, about 8 feet above the asphalt, maybe 30 feet from the sidewalk. It wasn't a streetlight or a porch light. It was softer, like a phone screen held at arm's length, bluish-white with no obvious source. For a second, I thought someone was balancing a lantern, but there was no movement to indicate a hand, no cord. It hovered there, motionless, and when it pulsed, dim, bright, dim, the porch light across the way answered in the same rhythm. Not a blink, more like a slow breath. I watched my own porch light through the window and could see the filament inside the bulb dim in time with the hovering glow. I don't know what made me do it, muscle memory or a foolish sort of courage. I stepped to the door, thumbed the deadbolt open, and cracked it so the screen door pushed on the chain. The glow didn't waver when I moved. Instead, it slid sideways, very gently, and drifted behind the neighbor's house. It vanished from sight as easily as if someone had turned a page. At that exact moment, my porch light steadied. The pulsing stopped, like someone had snapped a switch back into place. The world felt small and focused in that second, like everything had been centered around that one motion. I left the door chained and walked down the steps to the sidewalk. The air was colder than it had been when I went to bed, a tight, clean cold that sat in my lungs. The street smelled faintly of wet asphalt and the sour of someone who'd cooked fish for dinner. It was quiet, and the quiet felt like a separate thing, one you could hear, thick enough to press at your eardrums. From the sidewalk, I could see where the light had been. Nothing. No mark, no smoke, no reflector on the pavement. Just a darker patch between two headlights. When I looked back up, the sky was full of stars. No drones, no planes, no blinking aircraft lights. Just the small constellation over my house and the heavy presence of the maple. I stood there for a long time, waiting for some refund of the sound. The clicking, the hush, anything. But the night gave me only my own breathing and the distant hum of an AC unit 3 houses over. I went back inside and closed the door, undoing the chain. The lock made the sort of small clack that suddenly sounded very loud. June stayed clamped to my lap like she was part of me. I turned every light on in the living room, not because I thought it would do anything, but because not doing anything felt like inviting more of whatever it was. The house looked ordinary in the harsh, full light. Books on the shelf, 2 mugs in the sink, the calendar still showing the month. Nothing seemed altered. I wanted to tell someone. I opened my phone, thumbed at messages, then realized my cellular bars were gone. Not missing a bar or two, no bars at all. The time on my phone still read 2:03 a.m., though the minutes ticked forward. I tried the landline in the kitchen and got dead air, the kind that says either the line is down or the world has decided to be quiet on purpose. The radio on the counter, my cheap one, the one I used for late-night storm listening, had a thin hiss where music should be. When I flipped through the stations, the hiss stayed the same and then cut to silence. Not a fade, just gone. I could have gone outside again. I almost went outside again. Then I remembered the click at the window. It had been an odd, mechanical sound, precise as a metronome. It occurred to me that whatever had been out there had known I was awake. More than that, it had known where I could see it. That feeling lodged itself behind my ribs and wouldn't leave. I lay on the couch and tried to make the night ordinary by reading. I read the same paragraph 3 times until my eyes blurred, then turned the page and tried again. The clock by the TV said 2:26. The house settled with tiny creaks that made sense, pipes shifting, wood contracting. But every so often, I would check the window and angle my head to the street like a person watching a pot they're not sure if it's boiling. Around 3:10 a.m., the metallic clicking came again. This time it wasn't at the window, but from the eaves above the driveway, a rapid staccato like someone tapping 2 metal spoons together. June bolted off my lap and ran to the hallway, pressing herself against the screen door as if she could slide through and be closer to whatever was outside. I went to the back door. The motion sensor light above flicked on and then off. The sensor didn't stay on. That would have been too easy. Instead, there was one short flash and then nothing. I watched the backyard for a long time. There was nothing there but my compost bin and the honeysuckle. The grass was still. My neighbor's window blinds were drawn. Every house on the block seemed asleep. The clicking stopped. The porch lights stayed steady. The world sighed and folded in on itself like a hand closing. When morning came, I did not move from the couch until light spilled from the blinds into the living room. The house felt normal in the daytime, the same way it does after a hard rain. Everything clean but slightly changed, edges a little sharper. I opened the front door and walked the yard, looking for a sign. I checked the maple's trunk, the sidewalk, and the strip of lawn between my house and the street. Nothing. No scorch marks, no dents, nothing to say something had hung there in the night. The only unusual thing I found was a small circular patch of pavement where the asphalt seemed slightly cleaner, like someone had wiped it. It could have been anything. An oil drip that had been washed, a spot where a car's headlights had shone, but it sat in the middle of the road where no car had parked. I took a photo, not because I thought it would prove anything, but because taking a photo made me feel like I had done something concrete. That day, people in my neighborhood went to work, kids took buses, the barista at the corner store still put too much sugar in my latte when I stopped on my way to the hospital. No one mentioned a glow in the street at 2 a.m., which wasn't surprising. I didn't bring it up either. You don't tell strangers about things that might mark you as the person who sees the things other people don't. I half expected to see a news story. Strange light in suburban street. But nothing came of it. At night, I found myself stupidly staring at the window. I closed the blinds before I could get to the point of going outside again. I tightened the chain on the door and left the hall light on. June slept on the end of the bed. When I moved in the night, she opened one eye and then turned over. A few nights later, the porch light flickered for no reason I could identify. I told myself it was a faulty bulb, and I changed it the next afternoon. My phone recovered its bars and the landline worked. The world resumed its usual small failures: a clogged sink, a missed delivery. I went back to work, to the routines that make days feel anchored. But every time a metallic sound hit the house, a guttering pipe during a storm, a neighbor's ladder against vinyl siding, I flinched like someone who still remembers a gunshot. And sometimes, walking in the dark from my car to the front door, I paused at the curb and looked up the street, waiting for a bluish pinprick to hang itself in the air and for the porch lights to breathe in time with it. The street was always quiet and ordinary. Once, for a moment, the porch light at Mrs. Duval's house dimmed, and I swear my heart did the same thing the light had done. A little skipping beat, waiting for the rest of the world to follow. I never saw the light again. I learned to not stand at the threshold in the small hours, to lock the door twice if the house felt too still. I washed the mugs until they were clean enough to see my face in them and went to sleep with the blanket pulled up to my chin. The clicking sound lived in the memory of that night like a loose coin in a pocket. One you feel but can't fit into the palm. An absence that was also a presence. It was around 3:40 in the morning when I first woke up. I remember because I looked at the clock on the stove after I got a drink of water. I wasn't supposed to be up. My back had been acting up again, and I'd finally managed to get a few hours of sleep, but something, I don't know, a sound maybe, pulled me out of it. I didn't hear anything specific when I sat up. House was quiet. My wife, Lorna, was still asleep. The dog, Cedar, hadn't made a peep. But I had that feeling like when you think someone's standing in the doorway even though the room's empty. Not fear, not at first. Just that low-level awareness, like something was off. I figured maybe one of the cows had bumped the fence again. We'd had a couple storms that week, and the wire along the east pasture was sagging. So I got dressed, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. It was colder than I expected. Not freezing, but more than it should have been for early May. No wind. No bugs. That was the first thing that hit me. The quiet. No frogs, no night birds. Just the gravel under my boots and the creak of the screen door behind me. Cedar didn't follow me out. He usually does. Even at night. He's an old cattle dog, mostly blind now, but he still perks up when I move around. That night he stayed curled up by the stove. I didn't notice that part until later. I headed down the slope behind the barn with the flashlight sweeping ahead. The beam wasn't reaching as far as it normally does, probably the fog. It wasn't thick, but it was clinging low, real patchy, especially around the tree line near the northern fence. Everything felt flat, like there was no depth to anything past the first 50 feet. That's when I saw them. All 16 of the cows, bunched up in the far northwest corner of the pasture, squeezed together like a pack of wet sheep. They weren't making a sound, no lowing, no shifting hooves. Just standing there, pressed shoulder to shoulder, facing the same direction. I remember calling out just a short whistle and a "hey there," expecting at least one to flick an ear or turn. Nothing. Every single one of them was staring straight up. Now, my cattle aren't skittish. They get spooked sometimes, sure, but they're used to coyotes and thunderstorms. They don't group up like that unless something's really got to them. And I mean, really, even then, they don't go quiet. But they were dead still, eyes wide, breathing hard. I could see their sides moving fast in the beam of my flashlight. I looked up too. Just reflex, I guess. Nothing there. Not a cloud, not a bird, not a sound. Just open sky and stars. Clear as you like. I scanned the fence line next. Thought maybe something had gotten in. A dog, or maybe a catamount, though we haven't seen one of those in years. The wire was intact, no paw prints in the dirt, nothing disturbed. I started walking toward them, slow, not wanting to set off a stampede. I've never seen cattle act like that before, and I've been doing this since I was 20. You could feel the tension coming off them, like they were about to snap and bolt, but they didn't. They stayed locked in that huddle, staring skyward. Halfway across the field, I turned my flashlight off. I don't even know why. Maybe I thought I'd see something better without it. The dark out there isn't like town dark, it's complete. But that night, everything had this weird pale tint. The sky was bright enough from starlight, and the field looked washed out, dim and flat. I looked up again, same stars, same nothing. But then, and I can't explain this part, I got this pressure in my chest. Not pain exactly, more like a weight. Like something was leaning down from above. I crouched without meaning to. My knees just buckled a little. The air felt thicker, not warmer, not colder, just heavier. I thought I was having some kind of episode. I actually slapped my own leg to test if I was awake. And I was. The cows hadn't moved. They were still locked onto the same spot, dead still, eyes wide. One of them, Merle, big red Angus, always the slowest to spook, had foam around his mouth. His legs were shaking. He looked like he was about to collapse. And then, just like that, the weight lifted. Not gradually. Gone, like flicking off a switch. The air felt normal again. My ears popped, like I'd come down from altitude. The cows turned all at once. Not bolting, not panicking. They just turned away from the sky one after another like someone had called them from behind. They started drifting apart, walking slow, like whatever had them was just gone. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat out on the porch with Cedar, who'd finally come over to press against my leg like he used to when he was young. He kept staring toward the pasture even after sunrise. Later that morning, I went back out and checked the grass where they'd been grouped up. Ground was dry, no burn marks, no circles, no impressions, just slightly flattened where they'd stood, which made sense. I called the vet to come check them that afternoon. Nothing wrong, no signs of disease, no stress markers, but they didn't eat much for a day or two. Just wandered. Real quiet. I've had weird stuff happen out here before. Insect lights on the horizon, distant humming, that kind of thing. Always figured it was just weather, maybe something military. Dugway's not that far, and they test all kinds of stuff out there. But this was different. The way those cows looked. The way it felt in my chest. The way Cedar wouldn't come outside until it was over. I haven't talked to anyone about it besides Lorna, and she thinks I just dreamed it. Says I was probably sleepwalking again, like I used to in my 30s. But I wasn't. I know I wasn't. The cows don't go near that corner anymore. They avoid it like it's fenced off. Nothing grows differently there. No dead patches. But they won't cross into it, not even when I put feet out. Last week, I caught Cedar standing at the window at 3:30 a.m., staring out across the yard. He doesn't see well anymore, but he stood there stiff as a board, just looking. When I walked over, he growled, this low, unfamiliar rumble I hadn't heard from him in years. I looked out too. Sky was clear, full of stars, nothing moving, nothing there. It started around 9:30 that night, give or take. I was up in the shed behind my brother-in-law's place in northern Arkansas, fiddling with the old transceiver we'd set up on a folding table. Nothing fancy, just a beat-up ICOM rig connected to a dipole we'd strung between two poplars. I was with Ryan, my friend from high school, who still called me Sully, even though no one else did anymore. We'd been doing this kind of thing off and on since college. Never really outgrew it. Some guys hunt, some fish. We chase signals. We didn't broadcast anything crazy, just used the call signs we'd registered, hopped through the 20-meter and 40-meter bands, talked to other hams about weather and gear and local stuff. Sometimes we caught long-distance skip off the ionosphere. That night we weren't getting much. A little chatter out of Tennessee, some guy in Texas with a bad mic. Then we picked up something different. It came in short, a burst. At first I thought it was just bleed from another frequency or someone testing their key, but it came again about 10 seconds later. A clean pulse, about a second long, then another, spaced perfectly, like a metronome, nothing in between. No voice, no ID, just a tone. Ryan leaned toward the speaker. "You hearing that?" "Yeah," I said. "Could be a beacon." We listened for a couple minutes. The signal stayed steady, same pitch, same interval. I wrote down the frequency, 14.312 megahertz, and flipped through a few logs on my laptop to see if it was a known beacon. Nothing came up. That wasn't weird in itself. Plenty of people run unsanctioned tests or looped Morse IDs on homemade rigs. What was weird was how clear it was. No fading, no drift, like it was coming from next door. We figured maybe someone local was screwing around, so Ryan grabbed the mic and keyed up. CQ, this is K5RTC. Anyone out there on 14.312? Over. We waited. Nothing. Then, exactly 5 seconds later, the same tone came again, but louder. Not just louder in volume, it sounded closer. Like someone turned up the gain on our end. Ryan glanced at me. That's not just me, right? No, I said. That's real. He keyed up again. This is K5RTC. We're hearing a repeating signal on this frequency. If you're transmitting, please ID. Over. Again, 5 seconds later, the same tone, but this time, after the tone, came our own transmission. Repeated back. Word for word, static-laced but clear enough. We just sat there for a few seconds. Ryan kind of smiled at me, half nervous. You playing a recording? No. You got a delay set up? Nope. We tested it. I said something into the mic. Testing, 1, 2, 3. 5 seconds passed. The tone, then testing, 1, 2, 3. My own voice slightly distorted, not like it was rebroadcast, more like it had been reconstructed. That's the best way I can explain it. Something off about the cadence, the inflection. We killed the transmitter and just listened for a while. The tone kept coming every 10 seconds now. Then it stopped, then came back. Then it started playing older things we'd said earlier in the night, conversations from an hour before mashed together in weird order. Snippets like, copy that, we're hearing noise on the wind's picking up here too. Yeah, might be Skip, but I don't know. That last one repeated don't 3 times, stuttered like a glitch. Ryan leaned over and shut the volume down. We sat in silence. Could be someone messing with us, he said, recording us, then playing it back. From where? I asked. The signal's clean. No Doppler, no fade. That's not a bounce. I stepped outside the shed for a second. Everything was dead quiet. The trees didn't even move. There was no wind, no bugs either. That stood out. Normally you hear at least a few cicadas this time of year, even at night, but it was like someone had put a lid over the woods. I walked around the side of the shed with my flashlight. Didn't see anything. The antenna was still up. Coax still tight. When I came back in, Ryan was sitting with his arms crossed, just staring at the radio. It was making a clicking sound now, like a Geiger counter. Not steady, random bursts. I'd never heard anything like that come from that set. He looked at me and said, I don't want to keep listening to this. So we unplugged it. Hard kill. Pulled the power entirely, not just the switch. I even unscrewed the antenna cable from the back, just in case. We sat around for a few minutes drinking warm beer and talking about how it could have been a prank. But neither of us really believed that. We weren't near anyone. His property's isolated, down a gravel road off a gravel road. No cell towers, nearest neighbors a 1.5 miles away. And even if someone had rigged a repeater or SDR set up nearby, it wouldn't explain the delay matching ours so precisely, or the weird way the voices sounded. Just to clear our heads, we took a walk down the tree line with the flashlights. It was past midnight by then. Still no sound outside, not even the creek behind the property, which should have been gurgling from all the recent rain. Then the lights flickered in the shed. We'd left a single bulb on inside. It went dim, then brighter, then dim again, like a power brownout, but the rest of the house stayed lit, just that one bulb. We both froze. Then the tone started again, from inside the shed. No power, no radio plugged in, just that same single-pitch tone, louder now, coming from somewhere in the room, not from the table, from the air itself. We didn't go back in. We just backed away slow and walked to the house. Didn't run, didn't speak, just went inside and locked the door. Around 3 a.m., the sound stopped. In the morning, we checked everything. The radio was cold, nothing damaged, antenna fine, but the logs on the laptop had been wiped. Not just the session from that night, everything. It wasn't reformatting, just gone. Empty directories. Ryan didn't want to talk about it. He's the kind of guy who jokes about everything, but not this. He packed up his gear and said he was going to take a break from radio for a while. I tried tuning into that same frequency a few nights later from home. Nothing. Dead air. Then, 5 seconds after I said something, a tone. I was out on the lake because that's where my head went when I needed to stop thinking. I'd been working 12-hour shifts at the plant for months, and the couch at home had started to feel like a trap. The boat was quiet. Old wooden hull, a cheap Coleman lantern in the bow for when the fog rolled in, and the dock light at the cabin was turned off so the bugs wouldn't swarm. It was late, past midnight, and the moon was thin and low, silver like a coin. The air off the water was suddenly sharp and clean after the summer heat. The sort of cold that made me pull the collar of my jacket up. I'd been casting for an hour, pulling in nothing but smallmouth and my own restless thoughts. The lake that night was one of those mirror lakes that copy the sky perfectly. Stars dotted the black top like ash. Wind wasn't enough to make a ripple, and the only sound besides my line hitting the water was the occasional creak of the boat and the frogs thumping the far reeds. I remember the first odd thing was the fish. I'd been watching the line bob for longer than usual and noticed the strike indicator twitching. Soft, polite, like a cat pawing at a curtain. Then the water right around the boat started to ripple in concentric circles, small and even, like someone was skipping stones out past the lilies, only there was no stone and nothing on the surface. The ripples moved toward me and then spread past the gunwale and died. No splash, no sound. It felt like the lake cleared its throat. I sat still. I told myself this was normal. Insects under the skin of the water, the wind in a funny pocket. I cast again. The bobber set down and the line hummed a different tone in the moonlight. The watch on my wrist suddenly jumped back 2 minutes. One of those little digital quirks you tell yourself is nothing and then look at twice. I checked my phone. It showed an alert saying no service, though I'd had a bar an hour earlier. I shut it and tucked it in my jacket like a talisman. Then, out toward the middle of the lake, something moved. At first I thought it was a bird. There was a bright smear of something skimming across the surface, far enough away that I couldn't make out what it was. But birds make sound, or at least flap, and this thing made nothing. It skimmed like someone had dragged a marble across a sheet of glass. The surface stayed flat, no splash, no wake, just a narrow silver track where the moonlight gleamed. It moved fast and sure, then slowed, then crossed an old marker buoy, and then it changed. That's the detail that stayed with me, the way its reflection folded. For a heartbeat, it was a perfect silver sphere skimming the water, small and bright, and then it flattened like a coin tossed flat across a table. It didn't ripple the water the way something touching would. It bent the light, and when the light bent, the stars behind it slid a half degree like someone had nudged the whole canvas. I'd fished most of my life. I knew the lake. I knew the way shadows sat on the water. I'd seen floating logs and litters and the occasional boat with a reflect strip. I'd never seen anything move like that, silent, precise, like a pebble rolling without touching. I thought about grabbing the cheap camcorder I carried for odd shots, but hands that had been steady for years suddenly shook enough that the tripod would have trembled. The sphere, if it was a sphere, circled once 50 yards from me and then moved again, as if it had been checking something. The pattern it traced was odd, like someone drawing circles with a ruler bent into a ring. I could see a hint of something metallic, like the moon was reflecting off polished chrome. The soundless motion made the lake feel enormous and very thin. Then it was gone. Not like it flew away, not with a whoosh. It just stopped being there. 1 second there was a silver line, the next the water read like a page with the line erased. The ripples faded. The frogs resumed as if they'd been on a break. I sat in my boat, holding the rod until my arms cramped, waiting for the water to betray the rest of the story. I got back to the cabin at dawn before the sun, because the boat ride kept the adrenaline from settling, and I needed to move under my own power. The boards creaked as I tied up. The dog, Abby, did her small, irritated bark as if I'd been late to feed her. I tried to tell Mary, the lake's owner, neighbor, and a friend who had a rough laugh and even rougher coffee, but words kept catching in my throat like someone had duct taped them. I said it anyway, because you always say it aloud to see if it sounds ridiculous. "A silver ball," she said when I got to her porch. She was practical in a way that made you feel ridiculous for worrying. "At this hour? You sure you weren't dreaming?" "I was awake," I said. "I had my rod out. I was watching." She chewed the inside of her cheek like she thought there might be an angle I was missing. Maybe a seal or something keeps coming in at night? She smiled in a way that let me know she didn't believe the idea. You old fools and your stories. I didn't go out that afternoon. I told myself I'd been spooked by too many late nights, that the brain was a trickster. But curiosity doesn't like to be snuffed by logic, so I went back out 2 nights later with a camcorder and a thermometer, and the thing I've always had, stubbornness. I sat in the same spot, the same light, and watched the middle of the lake like a blind man might watch for the sound of a door. There were other oddities. The pressure on my ears dropped twice, like we were in a plane for a second, and then back. My watch again slipped time like it had been nudged. My hand brushed the metal of the rod, and it felt slightly warm, not like it should in the cool night. Wood smoke from a distant house curled across the far shore and smelled of someone grilling too late. The water hummed in a way I couldn't place. At 11:48, the camcorder's LED flashed a battery icon. I swapped batteries, annoyed, then swore when I rewound earlier footage later and found a 30-second block missing. The tape had a gap like it had been cut. The camcorder didn't look tampered with. The casing was intact. The tape showed an image of the lake and then a jump, like someone erased a sentence from a paragraph. A week passed with nothing. I told less and less to Mary because her laugh had a way of stretching the thing smaller until it felt like an imagination failing. Around the same time, I noticed a car parked at the edge of the road by the tree line most mornings. Black, older sedan, no one visible. It was always there at dawn and gone by noon like it kept its hours. I photographed it once, and the picture came out grainy as if taken through a filter. Then, 2 nights after that, at around 2:30 a.m., I saw it again. The sphere came from the direction of the inlet and skimmed like before, closer this time, and when it passed near the dock, the water around the pilings flashed like someone had poured mercury in the air. I reached out, and my hand passed the air where the thing had been, and it felt colder than it had any right to. I was halfway across the boards before I realized Abby hadn't barked. She'd stayed asleep on the porch, not even twitching. The next day, I overcooked the bacon in the morning and put myself in the truck with 2 beers and drove into town to talk sense. The hardware store had a regular who liked to sit and nod, and when I said strange things, he nodded and told me about wind tunnels and glints off oil slicks. The sheriff just smiled and said, "You see anything suspicious besides the old sedan?" And I told him about the light and my missing footage and tried not to sound like I was leaning on a tall tale. "You keep telling yourself you're safe," he said, "and maybe that's all you need for now." He scratched the back of his neck and handed me a cup of coffee. I left with nothing. The men came 3 days after that. I saw them before I heard the truck. They were sitting on my porch swing when I pulled in late that night after some extra hours at the plant. The porch light was off. The 2 men were in black suits, clean and unwrinkled, though they'd been sitting outside. They had a sort of stillness about them, like they were wood carved to sit in the right way. One had a thin face with a nose that made you think he measured his words before he made them. The other had a wide jaw and sat slightly farther back, shoulders set. They weren't young. They weren't old. They looked like they'd been cut out of a sheet of the same gray cloth. My first instinct was to back the truck up and leave. My second was to unlock the door and act like I hadn't noticed, because I didn't want to hand them the satisfaction of scaring me. That lasted about 6 steps. I walked to the porch, boots making the hollow sound of someone returning. "Evening," the thin-faced one said. His voice was flat, polite. "Mr. Cole?" "That's me," I said. My voice sounded like a man who had tried to hold on to his composure for too long. "Can I help you?" "Mind if we sit?" the wide-jawed one asked. "We don't want to bother you." They spoke like that. No hurry, no small talk, as if everything was arranged ahead of time and they were simply arriving to fulfill the plan. I wanted to tell them to leave. I wanted to ask how they'd gotten my address. I wanted to tell them about the silver thing, the missing tape, the black car. I instead said nothing and sat down on the opposite end of the swing like we were doing something civil. They didn't look at the lake. They watched me in a way that felt like a thermometer might watch a patient, checking heat, checking color. I noticed their shoes, plain leather without salt stains or grass bits, The thin-faced man's hands were folded across his knee. "You fish at night a lot," he said finally. "I do," I said. "Stick to daytime," the wide-jawed man said, as if the phrase was a small kindness. "Excuse me," I said. I didn't laugh. I didn't know which face to make when a stranger told me how to fish. The two of them smiled the way people do when they're choosing words carefully. "There are elements that are more active at night," the thin man said. "It's safer to be out in daylight." "I understand," I said, and the words felt wrong in my mouth. I wanted to ask who they were, which agency, where they were from, why they were telling me this like a neighbor giving me a weather tip. But the thin man had a small silver card in his hand, and when he slid it across to me, I looked at it like a passerby might peer through a window. The card had an emblem and a reference code. No department I recognized. The numbers looked neat. "Who are you?" I asked finally. "We're researchers," the wide man said. "Field sampling." He leaned forward like he wanted to confide something that would make me feel better. "Public safety." The words had weight. They were careful to sound like the sort of people you could file a complaint with. They weren't threats. They were instructions. "If there's something out there bothering you, tell us," the thin man said. "We can help document it. There's no need to be in harm's way." "I've seen something," I said. "A silver thing. On the water. It..." The sentence cut off like a torn rope. "It doesn't make sound." They nodded like men who took mental notes and didn't need to write them down. The wide man's hand moved to his pocket as if to take something out, and I flinched only because of old habits. He slid a pamphlet across to me instead. It was plain paper. "Nocturnal Safety Advisory. Avoid nighttime activities near water." Someone had printed it for a reason. Someone who liked to keep things quiet. "You sure you'll be all right going forward?" the thin man asked. They phrased the question like a neighbor asking about a broken fence, as though they were offering community service. "Do you work for the county?" I asked. "Do you have IDs?" "We're with a regional unit," the thin man said. "We can provide contact information through official channels if you request it." He said it like the ball was in my court and he'd move if I asked. They stayed for 20 minutes. They asked about my boat, my routine, what bait I used. They asked about Abby and whether I kept a light on the dock. The questions were mundane in a way that made me want to answer with precise things you might scribble in a log. Dates, times, numbers. They took notes on a small pad without looking like men bothered by handwriting. When they left, they stood at the edge of the gravel lane and watched the tree line until I couldn't see them. After they left, I checked my camcorder and my tape and my watch and the little items on the shelf where I keep tackle. The missing block on the tape hadn't returned. On the shelf, my spare reel of line that had been full was a little less full, as if someone had unwound a length to examine the filament and then wound it back badly. Days after they came, the black sedan stopped appearing at the road. The man at the hardware store started to smile my way again. Mary stopped laughing at me and instead asked if I wanted coffee more often, like she was trying a different kind of kindness. I went out during the day for a while. There were fewer ripples, fewer odd pressure drops. The lake behaved like a lake. I told myself I was done with nights on the water. I told myself I had been lucky and that the men had helped. I told myself that a person could be careful and be fine. I kept the card in my wallet for a while, not to call, but because it felt like keeping the name of a doctor you'd rather not visit, but might need. I left the camcorder in the top drawer for months. Sometimes I'd take it out and press play and watch the footage until my patience wore thin, and the missing frames made me feel like I was watching someone edit my life. Once, long after the men left, I saw a glint on the water from the porch, no more than a sliver like a coin tilting at an angle, and I thought of that night. The dogs stared at the far shore and then went back to sleep. I told myself to stick to daylight, then laughed quietly at the memory of the wide man saying the phrase as if it were advice you took for granted until you didn't. I never saw the silver thing again. I never got a call from whoever those men were to confirm their credentials. The watch stopped hiccuping. The sedan didn't come back. Life fit back into its slow routine with the same small dramas. A fence needing mending, a generator that wouldn't start, a neighbor's kid bringing over a raccoon that had been saved from a trap. The men in black became a story you might tell someone when you wanted to sound like a man who paid attention to the world. Sometimes, when I launch the boat at midday and the breeze is right and the lake runs like a polished plate, I let the rod hang loose and watch the horizon. I try to imagine that it was a charm, a trick of the light, an animal doing something graceful. Other times, I think about the way it bent the stars for a heartbeat, and the way the men slid the card across like people who knew the rules but wanted to keep the noise down. It felt like a warning and a favor at the same time. The two of them on my porch swing telling me to fish in the daylight like a neighbor telling me to wear a jacket. I do what they asked. I leave the night for the owls and for the coyote that sings, and I go out when the sun is up, when the lake is loud with dragonflies and the kind of life that doesn't move like a cut coin. Some nights I still wake at 2 and listen, half expecting the water to clear its throat. I stand at the window and watch the dark and the line of birches that stops the view. I tell myself I'm safe if I stay inside with the lights on. And I keep the card in my wallet because there are things a man keeps not because he trusts them, but because he needs to remember who told him to be careful. I finished charting the last med and pushed my chair back from the workstation because my legs were gone. It was the kind of night where everything felt slow, the third consecutive night shift, and a sky that had been leaking drizzle on and off for hours. My name's Elena. I've been a nurse on nights at St. Mary's for 6 years. The parking lot light by the front entrance hummed like an old refrigerator, and the night clerk was already in his cot in the security office, headphones on, so I grabbed my bag and headed out. Small things were off before I even left the unit. The telemetry monitors had been quiet for hours, usually at least 2 people beeping somewhere, but the boards were oddly blank, like everyone had been discharged at once. The oxygen wall gauges in room 12 cycled in a softer rhythm than usual, and when I checked the clock on the med cart, it had for a good 10 seconds before catching up. I made a joke to Luis at the desk. Ghost shift, huh? And he gave me that tired half smile and said, weird night. He didn't laugh. That's how nights start to pile up. A few things you can shrug off and a couple that don't fit together. On the way out, I passed the chapel door. The light above it was on, even though it's usually off at night. It threw a rectangle of warm yellow over the wet pavement. Someone had left a pair of shoes outside, neat by the step, like a person had walked out barefoot and never come back. I thought about asking security, but the guard's window was dark and empty. The automatic doors sighed and closed behind me, and I walked past the ambulance bay where the crew was finishing a cigarette. Long night? I asked. They shrugged. One of them squinted at the sky and said, storm's weird, then walked away like he didn't want to talk about it. I always park at the far end of staff lot because it's quieter. My car is an old Subaru with a coat of salt and a dent in the rear bumper that I keep promising to fix. As I crossed the row of cars, the lights from the building threw long bars across the asphalt. There was a stray patient information leaflet caught under a windshield wiper, flapping slowly. I stopped to pick it up and fold it, habit more than kindness, when every car alarm in the lot all at once erupted. It was the strangest cacophony I've ever heard. Metallic, thin, like someone had turned on a dozen tiny sirens. They didn't sound angry, not like alarms when someone's trying to break in. They sounded almost coordinated. A single note bouncing between vehicles like a ripple. I had the leaflet in my hands, and I remember my lungs emptying because the noise came on so sudden. People in scrubs looked up from half-sheltered benches. An orderly stepped out from behind the triage doors, and a security camera on the roof of the ER feed wobbled in its mount like a head turning. I froze under the fluorescent spill and watched the lot through the glass of the hospital's east wing. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the windows, as clear as if it were a literal thing in the air, a silver oval was drifting over the building. It was low enough that its underside, whatever underside meant for it, blocked a block of the sodium halo from the parking lot lights. The shape wasn't sharp-edged, more like a slab of metal wrapped in satin. It moved slow, deliberately, and the reflection made it look like it was walking across the sky right above the roofline. Even then, my brain kept offering safe explanations. Balloon, a blimp, a police drone. But the oval didn't have any lights, not the steady red or blinking greens you expect. No strobes, no beam. It made no sound, no thrum or distant wind. The lot alarms kept squealing in that same single pitch, and the world felt like a film running just a hair too fast or too slow. I watched the thing in the glass, and half of me was thinking to pull out my phone. The other half kept me rooted to the spot. My hands felt damp, and I realized I hadn't noticed until then that the coat I had on was soaked through at the shoulders, the drizzle more of a mist now. By the time I found the courage to look up, not at the reflection, at the real sky above the building, there was nothing. Empty clouds, the usual halo of sodium and moonlight. I blinked, and something like a pause in my chest eased. The car alarms cut off at the same breathless instant the oval vanished from the glass. No one clapped, no one cheered. People just stared at the paper in their hands or at the asphalt where spray was beading in little silver menace. A security guard came out then, flashlight tracing and collar up against the mist. His radio clicked and hissed but carried no one else's voice. He looked at me, eyebrows up, and I told him what I had seen, the reflection. He squinted up, then at the patrol car, then back at the night sky, and said, "You and me both," as if that meant anything at all. He told me the alarms had all gone off in an exact sequence and then shut off again, and that watch cams picked up the noise, but nothing in the frames but white smear for a second. He hesitated and then added, and the timestamp jumped on the feed, 9 minutes covered in static. He wasn't the kind of guy to make stories. He was the guy who counted cigarettes and kept a tidy desk. I heard the tightness in his voice, and I realized I was carrying the same thing. I pressed my forehead briefly to my steering wheel before getting in. My hands shook enough that they slid across the rim when I started the engine. The heater coughed, then warmed, and outside the windshield, the world went back to ordinary. Wet asphalt, a couple of patients huddled under a bus shelter, a couple of headlights moving away down the access road. I told myself, out loud, that I was tired and on edge. That made sense. That's the kind of sentence you give yourself when you want to believe the regular world is still the regular world. The drive home is normally a half hour of static and nothing, radio turned low, coffee cup cooling in the cup holder. That night, the radio cut out again around the county line for a full 10 miles, just dead air, and then came back like a train pulling into a station. The street signs looked wrong for a few minutes. Anytime I blinked, they seemed to be one word off, or the fonts thicker. My calendar notification dinged and told me it was 3:17 a.m. when my phone had said 3:08 at the hospital. I thought about the security feed timestamp and the guard's static report, and I told myself I was making patterns out of noise. When I pulled into my driveway, the house lights gave me a small domestic comfort. My cat, Miso, met me at the door with an accusation of cold paws and a tail curved like a question mark. I left my wet coat in a heap on the foyer chair and made coffee because it's what I always do, and because the motions of making it, measuring grounds, the metallic scrape, the whir of the kettle, feel like assembling the pieces of a life back into place. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with a mug and the window open a crack and kept watching the sky. I told myself I would go back in the morning and ask someone if they'd seen anything. I thought about calling my sister, but the story sounds thin when you say it out loud. A reflection and alarms and a thing that wasn't there when you turned. People give you a half-sympathetic laugh. You need rest, and that's a polite end to a strange night. At some point between news reports and the kettle's second refilling, I checked my watch again. It was 3 minutes ahead of the phone. I set them both down and left them there, not sure which one to trust. The world had a seam in it somewhere, like a pattern that got knit twice over in a place and made a ridge under your fingers. The coffee grew cold. Miso slept in the curled fist of my palm. Dawn came wrong and kind of soft, pink in the east through the clouds. I drove back to work at 7 because I always do, and the lot looked ordinary in daytime. Damp, quiet, the cars parked where they always were. The security guard from the night shift had taken a longer break and was back to rolling his wheelbarrow of cones. He greeted me like the world had been stitched back. I said nothing about the timestamp. I keep replaying the image that stopped me that night. The silver oval in the hospital windows, so clear and present in the glass, like something someone had decided to project because the night needed a center of attention. The sensible parts of me make lists, reflections, refractions, a billboard light, my mind running off shift work. Those explanations sit in the mind like shoeboxes for receipts. But the rest of it, how every car in the lot shouted together and how everything settled the exact moment whatever it was left the roofline, doesn't quite fit into a box. I went home that morning and did laundry, and later that day, I checked the security footage at the nurse's station out of habit, because we all do that now when something odd happens. The clip around 308 shows the lot, an empty rectangle of rain-slick asphalt, a smear of white where something clipped the camera for a fraction of a second, then silence. No shape, no craft. The timestamps are smudged for 9 minutes like ink left out in the rain. The footage doesn't answer anything. It kind of refuses to be useful. If you asked me what I think it was, I'd tell you I don't know. I know I walked past the chapel. I know the shoes were still there, dry now in the morning sun. I know the alarms went off, and the whole parking lot made a single metallic noise and then stopped. I know the reflection in the glass showed something silver drifting above the roof, and when I turned around, the sky didn't have it. I know I drove home and made coffee and watched the sky until dawn. I am here. I came home. I am writing this between shifts, and I look up when I pass the hospital at night now. I don't expect it to return. I just look because I can, and because sometimes the world hands you a thing that won't fold neatly back into normal, and the only honest thing to do is watch for it. I was halfway through the last cold beer when Gus stopped mid-chew and stared up. We had the little patio light on and the sprinkler set to the front lawn, the kind of late summer night that makes your skin feel like it's holding on to the day. My wife was at a friend's and I'd promised myself a quiet hour outside before collapsing into bed. Gus, boxer mutt, ridiculous paws, the only dog I've ever known to snore like a tractor, was stretched on his back next to my chair, legs in the air, the way he always was when he was absolutely content. He froze like someone had hit pause on him. His ears went straight up. I tipped my head and followed his line of sight. Above the maple at the end of the yard, the stars looked wrong. Not brighter, not dimmer. Wrong the way a misplaced note sounds in a familiar song. A handful of them were no longer fixed points. They were sliding, slowly together like leaves drifting on a stream. The cluster moved as one, a tidy group, and it crossed the sky as if it had a route it'd practiced. At first I thought it might be satellites. I've watched those slow chains before. Phone constellations, I think, the neighborhood kids used to call them, but these weren't linear. They kept roughly the same distance between each other, like they were keeping formation, and they moved in a curve that was too smooth to be aircraft at that altitude. The motion wasn't quick. It took maybe 3 minutes for the cluster to drift from the maple over toward the old radio tower to the south. When it stopped, the group sat in a new arrangement, one of those small, dumb rearrangements that makes your eye expect something to match, and it doesn't. Gus didn't budge from his belly. He nosed his head under the porch step and wouldn't come out even when I whistled. That was the first real skin prickle moment. My dog, who will fetch a lawn chair for an audience, refusing his own yard. Before the stars started moving, I had noticed a couple of other small wrong things, and I'm the kind of person who notices small wrong things. The radio in the kitchen that sits on the window shelf and plays oldies all the time had given a single thin burst of static that sounded almost like a voice, and then went quiet as if someone had taken the station away. The digital clock over the stove blinked 11:07, then skipped to 11:10 when I went in to get another beer. I told myself it was a power blip or the cheap clock losing its mind, and I left the porch light on for company. Those are the sensible explanations you reach for in the beginning. The dogs in the neighborhood went from their usual evening barks to a kind of high, single note, and then nothing. I noticed that because across the fence, old Mrs. Fenley's terrier, the one that yaps at our cat, usually keeps tenacious hours, and that night he cut off the same second Gus stared. The sounds snapped off like the world had been muted a notch. The breeze that had been moving the maple leaves died out. The night pressed closer, lighter somehow. The stars shone plain. Then that handful of them glided. I tried to get a photo. I've got a decent phone, newer model, and it usually handles night sky pictures better than I do. My thumb fumbled and my screen filled with a little spinning circle of loading for a beat, and then the camera app closed. I opened it again, and the image I took came out like a smear. More like someone had taken Vaseline to the lens than anything actually captured. Same thing when I pointed Gus's little LED collar at the sky. The collar made a weak halo on the porch wood, but did nothing to the moving points above. The stars didn't respond to light. The cluster paused, and then, without looking like they accelerated, the stones in the sky shifted again and rearranged themselves into a line that wasn't a line, and then a compact shape, not a picture I knew. They settled like someone had set them down with a finger. I felt the urge to stand up and call somebody, because that's what you do when your brain wants proof. But I also felt the opposite urge, to stay perfectly still in the middle of a familiar backyard and watch what your eyes were telling you. My watch, cheap wristwatch, battery a year old, showed 11:14 when the stars began moving, and because I compulsively check it in a night like this, 11:17 when they stopped. I remembered the radio clock skipping earlier, and I told myself the watch was wrong. Later, I checked the microwave, and it said 11:14, and the app on my phone, once it stopped gyrating, agreed. Time felt one of those elastic things for a minute, the way a dream stretches an hour into a second. I didn't black out. I noted the seconds. The stitch was small but visible, like thread that doesn't quite match the rest of the cloth. Neighbors came out, not a lot, just the people who sleep with their windows open or keep their barbecue lights on. A half-dozen heads poked from porches along the street, and we did that shapeless communal thing. We squinted up, said, "You seeing this?" and nodded at each other like we were all seeing the same hallucination and willing it into common sense. Nobody seemed afraid enough to call the police. The sort of wrongness that could be filed under weird but not urgent crept up the street. When the cluster stopped, one of the stars wobbled a little and brightened, and for a second I thought it might be a meteor. It steadied though, and the brightness subsided. The new arrangement looked deliberate, like an arrangement someone had designed to be seen but not explained. I thought about how small we are under the sky, and how that fact doesn't change the teeth of the feeling. You can say it's awe, and that's fine and true, but there's something else, a hush that sits over your skin. Gus stayed under the porch. He let me come close and scratch his neck, but when I reached for the leash, he shifted deeper back into shadow and put his big chin on a step and refused. He wuffed softly and wrapped his paws over the top one like he was holding on. I ended up letting the leash drag behind a shoe because I couldn't make him stand. He trembled once and then was still again. He looked at me like he was deciding whether or not to trust his person. I decided to go next door and ask Mrs. Fenley if she'd seen anything. On the walk over there, the streetlights blinked in a pattern, one small blink every 3 seconds, then steady. The light pattern made me think of an old theater sign. She opened her door and let me stand in the porch light, the kind of solid lamp that made everyone's faces too white, and when I asked if she'd seen it, she nodded, slow. "They were moving," she said. "Not like anything I recall. My Harold," she tapped her chest where she keeps his wedding ring in a pocket. "He called it a dance, said not to worry." She paused, like she'd reconsidered something unsaid, and then added, "But Rufus wouldn't go out to pee all night. Wouldn't even look at the yard." Her terrier was, she said, trembling in a corner behind the fern. I told her Gus was on my porch, and she seemed to think that made sense, as if animals were tuned into a channel we barely hear. We went back to our yards. The cluster had rearranged again into a pattern I didn't have words for, like a constellation someone had redrafted for a different sky. My phone on the kitchen counter finally got a text from my sister. "You outside? My feed is wild." And when I opened it, there were a handful of clip messages from other friends saying they'd been watching too. Not everyone had seen them. Not everyone wanted to talk about it. The ones who did used a lot of the same phrasing, like a handful moved together. The dogs went funny. I tried to get more pictures. The second attempt, the camera app behaved like it had something loaded. It didn't want to show me. A buffer loop of black frames and one where a pale smear crossed the image and then the file corrupted. I uploaded the corrupted file to a cloud thing on autopilot and the upload failed. It was small, inconvenient technology failing, but it always feels like proof's the first thing to go when the world flexes. By midnight, the neighbors had drifted back indoors. Lights turned off one by one. Music behind windows started up again. The street resumed its quiet, the air a little cooler than before. Gus stayed under the porch. I brought him a blanket from inside and set it down near his head. He let me lay it and then folded himself deeper into the shadow. I sat for a long time after that, not sure whether I was waiting for anything or hoping nothing else would happen. The cluster eventually dispersed. The stars returned to their regular, gorgeous, stubborn points. The night did what nights always do. It let you think there's continuity again. Gus didn't move until dawn. He did come back into the house when Jenna's alarm went off next morning. She came over after my wife told her I'd seen something strange, and he trotted in like nothing was wrong. He slept nearly all day the way dogs do after a long night. I did what people do in these situations. I told the story in pieces to Mrs. Fenley, to Jenna, to a coworker who raised his eyes and said, "Huh, weird," and then to my wife when she came home that afternoon. We walked the yard at dusk the next night, us all looking up, and nothing repeated. The maple's leaves turned, the streetlights hummed in their usual way, and the sprinklers kept to their schedule. There's no tidy ending. Gus will sleep on the porch sometimes now when the evening smells like rain, but he never stretches fully out under the stars like he used to. He keeps one eye open, and if I glance up at the sky and see a pattern that's just slightly off, one that might be a plane, or might be a group of satellites, or might be nothing, my first instinct is to hunch my shoulders and call him in. The memory of the stars moving stays like a small ache in the back of my throat, easy to ignore until something else nudges it. I make coffee in the mornings, check the clocks, and go to work. Life holds its edges in place. The dog lies under the porch and watches, and that feels like reason enough to look up. I woke up to the cuckoo clock being quiet. That's the stupidest way to put it, but it was the first thing that felt wrong. I sat up, squinted at the little wooden bird jammed into its door, and the hands on the face wouldn't move. They were frozen. The minute hand pointed at the 4, the hour hand slid a hair past 3. 3:14. I rubbed my eyes and glanced around the kitchen. The digital clock on the microwave read 3:14 too. The oven display was 3:14. The old brass alarm clock by the bed was stopped at 3:14. Even the cheap phone I keep on the counter showed 3:14 a.m. exactly, like someone had pressed pause on the whole house. May sleep-talked something from the other room and rolled over. I didn't rouse her. There's a limit to how much weird you dump on someone at that hour, and I've learned to save the big talk for daylight. I put on my boots and a jacket and grabbed the flashlight by the door and left the house slow, the floorboards complaining under me like usual. The dog, Hank, lifted his head and watched me without getting up. He followed when I opened the screen and didn't bark. Outside, the air was that clear, slightly sweet cold you get in spring before the sun wakes. The yard looked ordinary. Drooped garden hoses, the mailbox leaning the wrong way from last month's wind, the path to the barn worn where I walked. I glanced up at the sky because it felt like the natural thing to do when something small has gone wrong. There was no moon, no fireworks, just low, scattered stars. But above the barn, just beyond where the roofline cut the sky, there was a pale cone. It hung there like a spotlight, but softer, like someone had put a faint white paper cone over the glow of a porch light. It didn't flicker. It didn't hum. It just sat, the way headlights sit when a car idles. For a minute, I stood on the porch and did the sensible thing. I checked all the clocks on my phone again. 3:14. I turned my watch over in my hand, one of those old field watches my father gave me. It ticked, but when I looked down, the face matched the stopped clocks. The digital readout on the truck dashboard, however, had switched to a normal time, 3:28. The truck lit up like nothing was wrong. I hated the way that made my stomach twist. Some things obeying, some things refusing. The chickens were clustered by the coop door like they were waiting for somebody to tell them it was morning. They're always loud at sunrise, but now they were almost silent. A rooster rifled his throat and stopped halfway through. The cows in the pasture over by the creek were lying down in a neat line, heads to the west like they had been told to watch. When I clicked my flashlight on and walked toward the barn, Hank padded beside me the whole way and kept his nose low. He didn't jump at the light the way he sometimes did at raccoons. He just looked at that peanut of a cone of light and kept walking. The cone didn't touch the ground. It sat maybe 10 feet above the roofline over a pile of hay bales. When I got to the lower gate, I noticed the air smelled faintly sweet. Not like smoke, but like new-cut wood mixed with something I couldn't name. The grass under my boots felt warmer than the grass a few steps away. Not hot, no singe marks, no smell of fire, but like the sun had been there a beat earlier and moved on. I went up into the loft on the ladder because I wanted a better look. The cone edged across the hay in a soft crescent, and where it touched, the hay looked a shade paler, not burned, just altered. When I reached out and touched a bale, it felt normal, dry and springy. A fly landed on my knuckle and left without buzzing. When I climbed back down the ladder, the flashlight clicked off in my hand, first time that cheap thing had ever died on me. I hit the button again, it came back. Hank gave a small woof like a laugh and nosed my calf. I checked the generator in the shed, partly out of habit, and partly because if something electrical was odd, maybe the generator would tell me. It fired up like it always did, and the gauge read steady. I stood there listening to it for a while to make sure, then shut it down because I didn't want to disturb whoever, or whatever, was hovering over the barn. I don't know why that felt decent to me, but it did. Some part of me wanted peace, like touching the generator made me feel less naked. I walked the perimeter of the pasture. The cows kept their heads turned, chewing lazily, unbothered by my presence. The pond at the far end had a perfect circle of mist over it, tiny spirals rising like the breath of something sleeping. When I tossed a pebble, the ripple ran out and came back like it always does. Nothing dramatic. No monster surfacing, nothing. Just quiet. An ordinary lake behaving ordinarily. I called Jeb over 2 fields. He's the neighbor who works nights at the feed mill, because if something weird is happening, it's better with a witness who isn't your wife. He came with a flashlight and a cigarette, hair sticking up like it had been combed with his fingers. He craned his neck once and said, "Huh, that's a proper light." He didn't say more, just stood with his hands in his pockets, looking like someone trying not to be impressed or afraid. We both knew silence. After a bit, Jeb said his radio had lost signal at 3:14:2, and his truck clock stuck. He said he drove down the lane and his headlights threw normal beams, but when he turned toward the barn, his dash flickered. We argued quietly about whether to call the state or the sheriff. We didn't call. We stood and waited until the sky started to wash toward dawn, and the cone dimmed into nothing like someone had slid a sheet over it. When the cone vanished, the air felt fuller. Birds began their hesitant songs like something had given permission. Jeb lit another cigarette and took a slow drag. "Weird," he said again, like that one word could close a sentence instead of open it. Back in the house, May had finally come out and put the kettle on. She asked what took me so long, and I said, "Nothing important." That was a lie, but there wasn't any better way to say it with coffee and toast burning on the other side of the table. We ate in near silence, trading looks when the phone buzzed with the neighbor group chat. Someone had posted a picture from town of all the clocks at the courthouse frozen on 3:14. Someone else said their car clock had been stuck for an hour. Nobody had a story that made the whole thing sensible. The rest of the day was ordinary in the ways farms are. Fix the fence by the lane, check the drip on the new pump, haul a bale to the backfield. At dusk, we walked out to the barn again, out of habit or to prove it hadn't been imagined. The hay bales were their usual color. The air smelled like hay and diesel and rain on the horizon. The clocks in the house tick normally now. I set the cuckoo clock back when I got home, and it chattered like nothing had happened. My phone showed times and messages, and the internet running its small, indifferent world. But the spot of altered grass where the cone had touched stayed lighter for a week, like a ghost of a footprint. At night, Hank would refuse to sleep near that part of the barn and started choosing the porch instead. Sometimes when I closed my eyes, I could see the pale cone steady over the bales and feel that small warmth underfoot. I told May an evening or two later, and she said, maybe it was some kind of maintenance light. I nodded because it was easy and quiet and maybe true, but my hands still remembered the way the flashlight stuttered when I climbed down the ladder. I don't have an answer for it. I have clocks that froze at 3:14 and a spot in the field that didn't like Hank sleeping near it. I have Jeb's shrug and the ways the cows looked at dawn. I have the way the barn roof holds the memory of light for a full week after the sky let it go. Life went on, as it always does, which is the strangest kind of proof that whatever it was, it didn't mean to take what we had. It only paused us for a while, and then, as quietly as it had arrived, it moved on. I went out to the point because I couldn't sleep. It was one of those October nights where the fog sat low and thick, the kind that makes the harbor lights look like someone spilled honey on the water. I took a thermos and my old flashlight, no headlamp, nothing fancy, and walked the usual path down the rock slabs toward the shore. The surf was a steady hush, not the angry crash of summer storms, just the slow, regular breathing of the sea. I like that sound. It makes the rest of the world small. Before anything odd happened, there were small things that didn't fit right. My truck clock had jumped 20 minutes forward on the drive down, the kind of glitch you blame on a loose battery. The CB on the bench by the old pier hissed and then went dead when I clicked it. A burst of static that sounded like someone ripping paper. The gulls, which usually argued at midnight over a broken crab trap, were quiet. I looked for them, then realized all the birds had gone hush as if someone had closed their mouths from above. I stood on the rocks and sipped from the thermos. There was no moon to cut through the fog, just a pale glow from the town behind me. A small lobster boat idled out in the channel, its running light a puncture the color of a match. I could hear the engine in the distance, and then it clipped out, sputtered, and died for a minute, just long enough for the wake to smooth. The owner had his radio turned up, but I couldn't hear a word. He coaxed the motor back to life and went on. That was when I saw something pale on the horizon. At first I thought it was a fishing buoy or a flare, some normal night thing you learn to read quickly. It wasn't like that. It rose out of the water a little way off, small and white, and it hung a foot or two above the wave crests like someone had set a lantern on a table. It didn't flash or pulse, it just glowed steady. A clean, cold light that didn't look like anything I keep around the house. I swear I held my breath without meaning to. The thermos warmed under my hand, and the fog turned the light into a soft disk that pooled on the surface. It hovered there, maybe 30 yards out, not moving like a buoy and not bobbing with the swell. It slid inward a little, then drifted back, as if testing the water. No sound came from it. No motor, no hiss, only the usual small noise of the sea. I picked up my flashlight slow because the sensible part of my brain wanted to see it better. The beam trembled a little where I aimed. The incandescent bulb is old and lazy. The light from the object didn't react, it just hovered. I thought for a moment about calling the harbor master. I clicked the handheld radio and nothing answered. The boat whose engine had died earlier had gone on. I couldn't see a silhouette. The fog swallowed sound in a way that made distance worse. Then, because that's what people do when they want to make something less mysterious, I flashed my light at it. The pale glow folded in, not like a person ducking out of sight, not like a bulb switched off, but like something that had been lifted and put under the surface. The water stilled in that spot, like oil poured in, and the thin shimmer under the foam swallowed the glow. For a second after I flashed the light, there was a ring of brighter sea, then nothing, as if someone had erased that inch of ocean from sight. My heart pounded, which is embarrassing considering I'm 50 and have spent half my life on cold decks and late watches. I clicked the radio again. The static came back, and a voice half a mile up the harbor called, "You see anything, Tom?" It was Ray from the bait shop. I told him what I'd seen, and he swore quietly and said he'd had a customer say the same thing from a different dock at almost the same time. A pale light rising and going under when someone shone a torch. He told me to stay put. I didn't like the way his voice made a question of it. The thing, I don't know what else to call it, came up once more a few minutes later, further toward the headland this time, and it moved slower, almost lazily from one trough to the next. I trained the binoculars, and the image on the glass made it look almost surgical. A perfect white coin on the dark. When I tried to film it with my phone, the recording stuttered. The file saved 1 second of bright and then a blank as if the lens had been covered and then uncovered. There were other small oddities while I watched. My watch, the cheap digital one I forget to set right, blinked and then showed the right time again. The old pier clock that never keeps time ticked once and then stopped. The little fishing boat's radio that had been working went to a hiss the second the glow appeared and stayed that way until it sank. Things that had been ordinary a minute before started to have edges, like a cup with a hairline crack you only notice when you try to pour. I stayed until the light didn't come back. Dawn takes its time in that fog. It bled gray for what felt like an hour. I walked back to the truck slow because the rocks were slick, and I didn't want to stumble on a thing I couldn't explain. At the bait shop, Ray was sweeping the stoop, eyes red from too little sleep. He nodded to me without asking and handed me a coffee as if I hadn't left 3 minutes ago. "You see it?" he asked. I told him everything I could remember in small pieces. He listened and then said his customer had posted a clip on the local bulletin board, some kid's shaky video from a shoreline 2 coves over. The video was grainy and the clip cut after a second, but if you slowed it, you could see a pale patch over the water and then a sudden darkening. Comments below were a mix of jokes and guesses. Lantern, whale, prank. Someone else wrote that a retired Coast Guard guy in town swore he'd felt a pull on his compass that night. I drove home and the road smelled like seaweed and wet asphalt. I told May about it while I made sandwiches. She laughed at the idea of me waving a flashlight like a kid at a magic show, but she didn't roll her eyes. She asked if I was sure I wasn't dreaming. I told her the thermos was still warm and my camera showed 2 blank seconds. She said maybe it was some research crew, some biologist shining lights into the water, and I let that lie rest there because we both prefer answers that make a small amount of sense. The sun climbed and the fog thinned into a dull spit of warmth. I went back in the afternoon with my boat because fishermen like to know what's out there to complain about. The place where the glow had been was ordinary. Waves, a few silver slashes of fish, a smudge of dark that could have been weed. I dragged the echo sounder over the spot and it just read water, just like it always does. The crew from the other docks said they'd heard stories from other nights. A light that rose and retreated, some boats' radios cutting out, a compass that spun for a second. Mostly they shrugged. People in this town are used to the sea doing odd things. At dusk, I looked out the kitchen window and the horizon was clean. If something came up from the deep, it didn't come back up while I watched. I went to bed with a small, persistent unease and a dozen ordinary noises to tuck around it. The fridge clicking, May's radio in the other room, the little distant cough of engines down at the harbor. The last thing I remember before sleep was the idea that the sea had kept one secret and that maybe we had looked at it wrong. The next morning, the tide left extra kelp on the rocks where I'd stood, and I swept it up without thinking. Life at the coast has rules. One of them is you carry on even when the water gives you something you can't put a name to. I worked security at the Nevada Test and Training Range for a little over 4 years, most of it at the main perimeter gates. Most nights were boring, checking credentials, logging vehicles, making sure no one wandered where they didn't belong. My shift usually ran from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning, 12 hours sitting in that booth with a thermos of coffee and the occasional convoy rolling through. One night in February 2017, I was assigned to the South Gate. Cold, windy, moonless. The kind of night where you're grateful for the little space heater under the desk. Nothing unusual happened during the shift. 2 deliveries around midnight, a contractor who'd left his badge in the barracks and had to wait while his supervisor vouched for him, and one of the patrol units swinging by for a quick check-in around 3. When 6 rolled around, I powered down the terminal, locked the booth, and clocked out just like always. The system showed my badge out, meaning I'd officially left. I remember the scanner light turning green. I drove home, which was about 45 minutes away in Alamo. Roads were empty. I stopped at the Sinclair on Highway 93 for gas, grabbed a stale breakfast burrito, and pulled into my driveway just after 7. When I walked inside, my wife, Carla, was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She looked up at me and frowned. "Where are you going?" she asked. I was still in uniform, badge clipped to my chest. "Home," I said. "Shift's over." She stared at me like I was joking. "You already came home, last night. You got in around 7 like always, climbed into bed, and you were snoring before I even finished brushing my teeth." I laughed because I thought she was pulling one on me, but she didn't laugh back. She looked pale, confused. "Carla," I said, "I've been at the gate all night. I just walked in the door." She shook her head slowly. "No, you were here. I felt you get in bed. You woke up around 9, said you couldn't sleep, and went to watch TV in the living room. I even saw you sitting on the couch." I didn't know what to say. My uniform pants still smelled faintly of the booth heater, that metallic dust smell. The burrito wrapper was in my truck, but she was dead serious. I went into the bedroom. The sheets on my side were messy, like someone had been lying there. My pillow had that dent in it, like when you've had your head down for hours. Carla hadn't touched it. I tried to brush it off. Maybe she'd dreamed it. Maybe she'd been half asleep and imagined me there. But she was certain. She even described me tossing the covers off when I got too hot, exactly the way I always do. Later that day, I logged into the security portal from my work laptop just to double check. My badge history showed continuous activity at the Southgate booth from 6:03 p.m. to 6:01 a.m. No interruptions, no duplicate scans. According to the system, I never left. I didn't mention it to anyone at work. Not Diaz, not the other guards. Things like that, you don't bring them up. You don't want to end up in some office answering questions. But that night, when I went back on shift, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The booth looked the same as always, but I kept catching myself glancing at the chair, half expecting to see me sitting there. Around midnight, I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The desert was pitch black except for the faint glow from the lights above the gate. No wind, no sound, just dead still. I got this crawling feeling like someone was watching me. I scanned the fence line, the access road, the desert beyond. Nothing. When I went back inside, I checked the terminal again. My badge log showed me scanning out at 6:01 a.m. the previous morning, exactly when I remembered leaving. But there was another entry. Same badge number, same name. It showed me scanning back in at 7:12 a.m., the exact time Carla swore she'd seen me at home. The log had no workstation attached, no location code, just access granted. I stared at it until my shift partner, a guy named Morales, came by on patrol and asked if I was okay. I just closed the window and said, "Yeah." When I got home the next morning, Carla didn't say anything. She just gave me this strange look when I walked in, like she wasn't sure which version of me she was seeing. The sheets on my side of the bed were messy again. She swore she hadn't touched them. I was working as a field tech for a small aerospace contractor in 2014. Most of my job involved maintaining sensors, repairing damaged test equipment, and occasionally doing post-incident cleanup. Nothing glamorous. I was used to long hours in the desert, sunburned neck, dusty boots, and the constant wind cutting across the flat washes. One afternoon in late October, a small aircraft classified test project, nobody outside the contractor or military teams knew the details, crashed a few miles outside the southern boundary of the Nevada Test and Training Range. The crash wasn't fatal. The pilot walked away with minor injuries. My team was dispatched to help recover debris and clear the site for investigation. It was hot and dry, around 87 degrees when I arrived, and the smell of burnt composite hung in the air. I spent the first hour cataloging fragments, taking photos, and logging serial numbers for all the parts. Most of it was twisted aluminum and shattered panels, but a few pieces were intact, covered in a thin layer of soot. While the team was distracted, one guy measuring wing fragments, another bagging wiring, I noticed a small piece of scrap about the size of a smartphone tucked in the sand at the edge of the crater. It was smooth, metallic, darker than the surrounding wreckage, and oddly uniform, like it had been machined rather than broken. I picked it up. It was unnaturally cold, almost biting to the touch. I brushed off some sand, feeling the cold travel up my fingers. I knew better than to carry debris without logging it, but something about that little piece drew me in. It was heavy, solid, and unlike anything I'd seen before. I slipped it into my cargo pocket. The rest of the day went on normally. We collected what we could, secured the site, and were cleared to leave by the on-site officer. I drove back to my motel in Alamo, keeping the piece in my pocket all the way. The cold didn't fade. It was almost persistent, like it had its own temperature. That night, in my room, I put the piece in the top drawer of the small desk. I left it alone, just sat on the bed staring at the desert through the small window. I fell asleep around 11:30, exhausted, the scrap still cold in my drawer. When I woke around 6:15 a.m., the piece was gone. The drawer was empty. On top of the desk, where nothing had been the night before, was a small note, folded neatly. I unfolded it. In simple handwriting, it read, "Don't take what isn't yours." I blinked a few times, thinking I was dreaming. I looked under the bed, in my suitcase, even the trash can. Nothing. The note was the only thing left. My first thought was someone had entered the room, but the lock on the door was intact. The motel security camera facing the hallway didn't show anyone entering. The staff confirmed no one had been there. I shoved the note back into the drawer, hoping that would be the end of it. I felt uneasy, but told myself it was just a prank, or my imagination after a long day. Later that morning, I tried to call my supervisor to explain. When I described the scrap piece, the same smooth metal, the same cold, he got quiet and said, "Nathan, make sure you didn't pocket anything you weren't supposed to. The site's heavily monitored and there's nothing missing officially. Don't mention it again." Over the next few days, I kept my mind on the usual routine, checking sensor lines, repairing damaged conduits, filing reports, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching. Not actively, but present. While walking across the open desert to inspect remote sensors, I'd catch a shadow at the edge of my vision. It would disappear when I looked directly. Even at night, in the motel, the air in the room sometimes felt different. Heavier, colder near the drawer where the scrap had been. I avoided it, didn't open the top drawer, and I didn't sleep well. I asked a couple of fellow techs if they ever experienced anything odd at crash sites, or if they'd noticed things disappearing. They laughed it off. Desert heat, stress, long hours, they said, but I could tell by the way they looked at each other they weren't entirely dismissive. Weeks later, I returned to the crash site for follow-up checks. Nothing had changed, except a faint indentation in the sand where I had originally found the scrap. It was perfectly oval, maybe 6 inches across, the sand slightly fused at the edges. I kicked at it. It crumbled like normal dirt, but the impression remained, subtle and unnatural. I never found out what happened to the piece. No one ever mentioned it. No one came to recover it. I never tried to take anything again. The note stayed in my mind for months, folded and tucked in a notebook I carried for logs and sketches. Even now, when I think about it, I can feel the cold from that scrap metal, the way it seemed almost aware, like it didn't belong to this world, or at least not to me. And that note, the handwriting, the exact words. I don't know who left it or why. I never told anyone outside a handful of people I trusted. Talking about it meant sounding insane. But the desert, the crash site, the memory of that cold scrap, and the warning stayed with me long after I stopped working near Groom Lake. Sometimes when I open a drawer, I half expect it to be there again, lying in the same spot. The cold would be the first thing I'd feel, and I know I'd leave it there.